A West Virginia property was abandoned after something was found below. The flashlight beam cut through the thick, swirling dust of the root cellar, coming to rest on a heavy steel hatch that had no reason to be there. Thomas, an independent property appraiser contracted by a distant out-of-state trust, stood in the freezing dampness of the underground room and wiped away a layer of grime from the metal. The county blueprints in his leather satchel showed only a standard stone foundation for this isolated 1930s timber house in the dense Appalachian foothills. There was no mention of a subterranean extension, and certainly no record of the 4 massive, rust-pitted iron padlocks securing the hatch to the concrete floor. Something about the way the chains were wrapped suggested they were not meant to keep intruders out, but to keep the hatch firmly closed against whatever lay beneath it. The silence of the house above was heavy and absolute. It was late November of 2014, and the property sat at the end of a forgotten logging road off Highway 39, 20 miles from the nearest town. The previous owner, a retired structural engineer named Elias Vance, had died in a nursing home 3 months prior, leaving the 80-acre estate to a corporate trust. Thomas had spent the afternoon cataloging the main floors, noting the peeling wallpaper, the water damage in the ceiling, and the strange, obsessive way the windows had been boarded up from the inside. But it was here, in the windowless cellar, that the true nature of the property began to reveal itself. Kneeling on the cold floor, Thomas noticed a faint, rhythmic vibration traveling through the soles of his boots. It was incredibly subtle, like the distant rumble of a heavy freight train miles away, yet there were no train tracks anywhere in this part of the county. He placed his bare hand flat against the center of the steel hatch. The metal was unnervingly warm to the touch, a stark contrast to the near-freezing ambient temperature of the cellar. A thin wisp of foul-smelling air, reminiscent of ozone and old stagnant water, drifted up from the microscopic gap between the hatch and its housing. Thomas pulled his hand back, a cold prickle of unease washing over his shoulders. He returned the following morning shortly after 9 o'clock, carrying a heavy-duty battery-powered angle grinder and a crowbar. The morning fog was thick, clinging to the skeletal black trees surrounding the property and swallowing the sound of his truck door shutting. Down in the cellar, the air felt even more oppressive than the day before. The vibration was still there, steady and low, humming beneath the earth. Thomas set to work on the chains. The high-pitched scream of the grinder against the iron padlocks filled the small stone room, throwing bright showers of orange sparks into the shadows. It took nearly 40 minutes to cut through all 4 locks. When the final chain dropped to the concrete with a heavy, dead clatter, the cellar suddenly felt entirely too quiet. Thomas wedged the flat end of the crowbar under the lip of the hatch and leaned his weight backward. The metal shrieked as the rusted seal broke. A sudden, forceful exhalation of warm, dead air rushed out from the dark void below, carrying a smell so ancient and dense it made him gag. It smelled like wet copper, decaying limestone, and something faintly chemical, like antiseptic masking rot. He clicked his heavy tactical flashlight up to its highest setting and shined the beam down into the opening. The light did not hit a dirt floor or a simple root storage bin. It revealed a perfectly circular concrete shaft descending straight down into the earth, lined with heavy industrial steel rungs bolted into the gray walls. The shaft went down farther than his light could reach, disappearing into a haze of floating particulate matter. According to local property laws, an appraiser was only required to document accessible square footage, but an unrecorded subterranean structure could drastically alter the valuation or liability of the estate. Against his better judgment, Thomas secured his satchel, tested the first iron rung with his heavy boot, and began the descent. The air grew steadily warmer with each step down into the dark. He counted the rungs as he went: 20, 30, 40. The square of gray light from the cellar hatch grew smaller and smaller above him. By the time his boots finally struck a solid concrete floor, he had climbed down at least 60 feet beneath the West Virginia soil. The space at the bottom of the shaft was pitch black. Thomas swept his flashlight around, illuminating smooth, seamless poured concrete walls. He was standing in a small antechamber. To his left, a large electrical breaker box hung on the wall, its metal door hanging open. To his right, a heavy steel door stood slightly ajar. He moved toward the breaker box, noticing that the thick black cables leading out of it disappeared directly into the bedrock. With a gloved hand, he threw the massive main switch. Deep within the walls, a series of heavy mechanical clunks echoed, followed by the low electrical whine of large generators waking up. Row after row of caged fluorescent lights flickered to life overhead, casting a harsh, pale yellow glow down a long, impossibly wide corridor. Thomas stepped through the steel door and stopped, staring down the tunnel. The corridor stretched for at least 200 feet, driving straight into the subterranean heart of the mountain. It was wide enough to drive a small truck through. The sheer cost and logistical nightmare of excavating and pouring this much concrete in secret decades ago was unfathomable. Elias Vance could never have funded or built this alone. It was a military-grade installation hidden beneath a rotting wooden farmhouse. As Thomas walked slowly down the corridor, his footsteps echoing flatly against the walls, he noticed a series of identical metal doors lining the right side of the tunnel. He approached the first one, finding it unlocked. He pushed it open and shined his light inside, though the overhead fluorescence soon buzzed on. The room was not a storage closet or a utility space. It was set up exactly like a child's bedroom from the 1970s. There was a small wooden bed with a faded quilt, a dresser, and a small desk. But the unsettling details quickly became apparent. The furniture was bolted tightly to the floor, the walls were lined with thick, gray acoustic dampening foam, and high in the corner of the ceiling, a heavy glass dome housed a mechanical security camera, its lens pointed directly at the bed. Thomas backed out of the room, his breath catching in his throat. He checked the second door. It was an exact replica of a vintage kitchen, complete with a table, chairs, and old appliances. Again, everything was bolted to the concrete, the walls were soundproofed, and a camera watched from above. The appliances were completely gutted, the refrigerator had no motor, the oven had no heating elements, they were mere props. This was not a bunker designed to keep people safe from a nuclear attack. It was an observation facility. It was an enclosure designed to simulate a normal environment while closely monitoring whoever or whatever was kept inside. At the far end of the corridor, the tunnel opened up into a larger, circular command center. Banks of ancient, dusty electronic equipment sat dormant on long metal tables. Dust motes drifted lazily through the stale, warm air. In the center of the room sat a heavy steel desk with a single leather-bound logbook resting squarely on its surface. Thomas approached the desk, his heart hammering against his ribs. He opened the ledger. The pages were filled with meticulous, handwritten notes dating back to 1982. The early entries discussed structural integrity, seismic monitoring, and depth excavation. But as he turned the pages, jumping forward through the years, the tone of the writing shifted. An entry from October of 1997 read, "The localized tremors have increased in frequency. It is testing the eastern boundary of the enclosure. We have increased the concrete density by 3,000 pounds per square yard, but the audio sensors indicate it is still moving through the porous limestone." An entry from April of 2003 was written in a hurried, frantic scrawl. It read, "The mimicry behavior is worsening. It arranged the mock furniture to perfectly match the upstairs living room. It knows the layout of the house. We cannot let it reach the surface layer." Thomas felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. He looked up from the book. At the very back of the command center, set deep into the curved concrete wall, was a final door. It was different from the others. It was a massive, circular blast door resembling the entrance to a bank vault, complete with a heavy rotating locking wheel. Set at eye level in the center of the steel was a small, thick observation window made of layered quartz glass. The wheel was turned to the locked position, but the thick steel locking bolts were straining, slightly bent outward, as if something of unimaginable weight had been pressing against the door from the other side. Drawn by a morbid, terrifying curiosity, Thomas walked slowly toward the blast door. The ambient warmth in the room was coming entirely from the metal surface of this door. The vibration he had felt upstairs in the cellar was infinitely stronger here, thrumming up through his legs and rattling the teeth in his jaw. It was not a mechanical vibration. It felt organic. It felt like the slow, rhythmic breathing of something impossibly massive resting just behind the steel. He stepped up to the quartz glass window and peered through. At first, he saw only absolute blackness. It was a dark so complete it seemed to absorb the light from the room behind him. He pressed his face closer to the glass, cupping his hands around his eyes to block out the glare. As his eyes adjusted, he realized the blackness was not empty space. It was a physical surface pressed flush against the other side of the glass. It looked like dark, leathery skin covered in fine, ash-colored scales. As he watched, frozen in terror, the surface slowly slid downward, revealing a pale, milky expanse beneath it. It was an eye. An eye the size of a dinner plate, devoid of any pupil or iris, glowing faintly in the pitch black of the cavern beyond. The pale eye fixed entirely on Thomas. The deep, rhythmic vibration abruptly stopped. For a terrible, suspended second, the absolute silence of the underground facility was deafening. Then, a new sound began. It was a soft, wet tapping against the inside of the thick glass. Tap, tap, tap. The rhythm perfectly matched the frantic, terrified beating of Thomas's own heart. The massive blast door groaned, the steel hinges shrieking as the immense pressure on the other side suddenly increased. The bent locking bolts shifted forward another fraction of an inch, shedding a rain of rust flakes onto the concrete floor. Thomas broke away from the door, his mind entirely consumed by blind panic. He abandoned the logbook, abandoned his heavy flashlight on the desk, and ran. He sprinted back down the impossible corridor, his boots slipping on the dusty concrete, ignoring the empty observation rooms that now felt like open mouths waiting to swallow him. He reached the bottom of the shaft and threw himself at the ladder. He climbed with reckless, desperate speed, tearing the skin from his knuckles against the rusted iron rungs, not daring to look down into the dark he was leaving behind. The heat of the shaft seemed to rise with him, carrying the faint, terrible sound of bending steel echoing up from the depths. He hauled himself out of the cellar hole, his lungs burning, and slammed the heavy iron hatch shut behind him. He did not have the padlocks to secure it. He dragged heavy wooden crates, broken furniture, and a rusted anvil over the hatch, piling hundreds of pounds of debris over the metal before sprinting up the cellar stairs and out of the house. He threw his tools into the back of his truck, started the engine, and tore down the dirt logging road, sliding wildly around the curves until he finally hit the pavement of the highway. He did not stop driving until he was 3 counties away. Thomas never filed his official appraisal. He sent a brief, vague email to the out-of-state trust, citing severe structural hazards and toxic black mold, and refused to accept any payment for his time. According to county zoning records, the property was quietly seized by the state less than 2 weeks later under an obscure environmental protection mandate. No official explanation was ever released to the public. However, hunters and locals who frequent the deep woods along Highway 39 have whispered strange stories in the years since. They claim that shortly after the property was condemned, a convoy of unmarked heavy-duty cement trucks drove up the logging road in the dead of night. They poured thousands of gallons of concrete directly into the foundation of the old house, sealing whatever lay beneath it under a solid, impenetrable cap of stone. Yet, on still windless nights in late autumn, residents living in the valleys miles away claim they can sometimes feel a low, rhythmic thrumming deep in the earth. A vibration that pauses, changes tempo, and slowly seems to learn the sleeping patterns of the towns resting above it. A missing 411 case where footprints suddenly stopped. The footprints in the morning frost did not fade away slowly, nor did they show any signs of a struggle or a sudden violent fall. They simply stopped. It was near the edge of a high granite ridge, about 2 miles north of the main trail, in an area of the state forest thick with ancient pine and jagged limestone outcroppings. The search coordinator, a man who had spent 30 years tracking missing persons through these specific mountains, knelt and stared at the final depression in the pale white earth. The left boot print was deep, pressing heavily through the crisp layer of frost and into the damp, dark soil beneath. There was no right boot print to follow it. Beyond that single heavy indentation, there was only a vast, undisturbed sheet of frost covering the flat stone of the ridge. Nothing had brushed against the nearby ferns. No low-hanging branches were broken. It was as if the man had stepped forward with his left foot and simply ceased to be tethered to the ground. The geography of the upper basin was notoriously deceptive, a sprawling network of deep ravines and dense timber that could easily turn a seasoned hiker around. But the missing man was not a tourist. His name was Elias, a local surveyor who knew the topography of the northern ridge better than anyone in the county. He had walked out of his small cabin at 6 o'clock on a Tuesday morning in late October. The air that day had been crisp but clear, the kind of autumn morning that drew locals deep into the woods before the heavy winter snows arrived. He was dressed appropriately for the season in a heavy wool jacket, sturdy leather boots, and carried a small canvas pack with enough supplies to last well through the afternoon. According to the missing person report, Elias had only intended to check a line of remote trail cameras he maintained along the eastern edge of the property line. His wife told the 911 operator that he knew every stone and creek in that section of the woods. He had promised to return by noon for lunch. When 3 o'clock in the afternoon passed with no sign of him, a quiet, creeping unease settled over the house. When dusk arrived, bringing with it a sharp drop in temperature and the deep, total darkness of the mountain valley, that unease turned into a pressing emergency. By midnight, the first official search teams had already assembled at the trailhead with high-powered flashlights, radios, and a team of tracking dogs. The tracking dogs provided the first clear indication that this would not be a standard search and rescue operation. The handlers brought 3 experienced bloodhounds to the front porch of the cabin, allowing them to catch Elias's scent from a worn flannel shirt. Initially, the dogs performed exactly as trained. They pulled eagerly at their long leashes, leading the handlers up the familiar winding incline behind the property. They moved swiftly for the first hour, cutting through the dense, dark timber with absolute purpose, their noses close to the damp earth. But as the search party crossed the lower tree line and entered the shadow of the upper ridge, the behavior of the animals drastically changed. The lead dog suddenly stopped pulling. It lowered its head, sniffing frantically at a single patch of dead, frozen grass, before letting out a low, trembling whine and backing away. Within minutes, all 3 dogs sat rigidly in the cold dirt, refusing to take another step forward. They did not bark at the darkness. They did not circle looking for a lost scent. They simply sat close to their handlers, staring up into the black canopy of the towering pines, shivering violently despite their thick coats. The handlers eventually had to carry the dogs back down the trail, leaving the human volunteers to push forward alone. Witnesses in the search party later claimed that the woods felt entirely dead that night. The wind, which usually howled relentlessly through the narrow canyons of the basin, had dropped to an absolute unnatural standstill. The silence was so profound and heavy that the searchers could hear the blood rushing in their own ears, and the rhythmic squeak of their waterproof gear seemed to echo for miles. Usually, the forest at night was alive with the rustling of small animals in the underbrush, the sharp creak of settling wood, and the distant, lonely call of owls. But on that night, several seasoned rangers reported feeling an immense, suffocating pressure in the air as if they were walking through the interior of a massive soundproof room. Every beam of light sweeping through the trees seemed to stop short, swallowed by an unusual density in the dark. At 3:30 a.m., a team of volunteers sweeping the floor of the lower ravine found the first physical piece of evidence. It was Elias's canvas backpack sitting perfectly upright on the flat, mossy surface of a large river boulder. It had not been dropped in a panic or thrown aside in a rush. The shoulder straps were neatly arranged, tucked carefully beneath the base of the bag, and all the buckles were securely fastened. Inside, they found his metal water bottle, entirely full, alongside his compass and a spare pair of heavy insulated gloves. The most unsettling detail of the discovery was the placement of his two-way radio. It was resting perfectly balanced on top of the closed backpack. The power switch was turned on, indicating the battery was still alive, but the volume dial had been rotated completely down to zero. It was a bizarre and troubling contradiction. A man lost or injured in the wilderness relies on a radio as his primary lifeline to the outside world. To deliberately silence the device and abandon it so carefully on a rock suggested either a calm, intentional choice to vanish or a state of mind that could no longer comprehend the concept of rescue. As the sun finally rose, casting long, pale, gray shadows across the basin, the trackers located a distinct set of boot prints in the soft mud near the boulder. The tracks clearly belonged to Elias, perfectly matching the heavy, deep-lug tread pattern of his winter boots, but the path they carved through the landscape made no logical sense. Instead of heading back down the gradual slope toward the safety of the valley and the highway, the prints turned away from home. They aimed directly toward the steepest, most unforgiving section of the mountain, a tangled mass of briars and loose scree. According to the lead rescue coordinator, the stride of the footprints was deeply alarming. The distance between the left and right impressions was impossibly wide. The spacing suggested that Elias was either running at a breakneck, desperate speed up a 45-degree incline, or taking massive, leaping bounds through thick underbrush that should have been physically impenetrable. A human being could not maintain that kind of momentum up a mountain face without tripping, stumbling, or leaving signs of broken branches and crushed vegetation. Yet, the tracks were clean, perfectly spaced, and relentless in their upward trajectory. 200 yards further up the punishing incline, the team found another piece of the puzzle, and it only deepened the growing sense of dread. Draped carefully over a low-hanging hemlock branch was Elias's heavy wool winter jacket. It was not torn, snagged, or hastily discarded. It had been meticulously unbuttoned, taken off, and folded neatly over the damp wood. The temperature in the valley had dipped to 28 degrees overnight. Stripping off a primary layer of winter clothing in sub-freezing conditions is a recognized symptom of late-stage hypothermia, a fatal phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing, where a freezing brain falsely signals to the body that it is burning up. Yet, the veteran trackers noted immediately that the timeline for hypothermia simply did not fit the physical evidence. Based on the distance from his cabin, Elias would have reached this specific spot only 2 or 3 hours after leaving home, far too early for the deep, delirious, final stages of freezing to set in. Furthermore, the victims of hypothermia walk with a staggering, chaotic gait as their motor functions shut down. Elias's footprints leading away from the abandoned jacket remained straight, deep, and incredibly wide, showing a level of physical power and purpose that directly contradicted the symptoms of a dying man. At 9:15 a.m., the radio operator stationed back at the base camp experienced a highly unusual anomaly. For several uninterrupted minutes, a burst of thick, heavy static broke through the primary search and rescue channel. The operator attempted to clear the frequency, asking for any team in the field to identify themselves and report their status. The static did not break. Instead, it slowly shifted in tone and pitch, forming a rhythmic mechanical pulse that sounded almost like heavy, labored breathing, echoing through miles of empty, hollow pipe. Behind the dense wall of static, faint, metallic clicking sounds began to echo in a slow, deliberate, and entirely unnatural pattern. The transmission lasted for exactly 2 minutes before the channel snapped back to dead, empty silence. The operator immediately radioed all the search teams in the field. Every unit confirmed that their radios were secure and none of them had triggered their microphones. The origin of the signal was never traced, and no other frequencies in the area reported the interference. By 11 o'clock in the morning, the primary tracking team finally reached the high granite ridge. The punishing terrain here leveled out into a barren, windswept expanse of pale stone, broken only by thin, shallow patches of frosted soil and dead moss. This was the exact location where they found the final, impossible sequence of footprints. They followed the wide, bounding strides across a shallow depression of dirt that led toward the sudden drop-off of the cliff. The tracks moved in a perfectly straight, unwavering line. The searchers walked parallel to the prints, giving them a wide berth, deeply careful not to disturb the evidence. They counted exactly 12 massive steps across the morning frost. And then there was the 13th step. The left boot drove deep into the soft, yielding earth, crushing a thick layer of dead green moss. The toe of the print was angled slightly forward, deeply embedded, implying a tremendous amount of forward momentum. But there was absolutely no right footprint to follow it. The trackers instantly fanned out, circling the immediate area in a wide 50-foot radius. They shone high-powered flashlights into the narrow, dark crevices of the surrounding rock. They swept the distant tree line, looking for any sign of broken timber. They looked for signs that Elias had jumped to another rock, but the nearest boulder was 30 feet away. They looked for signs of a sudden fall, a dragging rope, or the massive sweeping tracks of a large predator that might have carried a man away. There was nothing to be found. The earth was entirely undisturbed. The delicate crystalline frost on the granite just inches away from that final boot print remained entirely intact, glittering like broken glass under the cold, pale sunlight. The trail simply ceased to exist. As the searchers stood in a circle around the impossible end of the trail, the atmosphere in the upper basin violently shifted. The oppressive, heavy silence of the morning was suddenly broken by a deep, low, humming wind that seemed to vibrate directly through the thick rubber soles of their boots. The sky above the ridge, which had been a clear, piercing, cloudless blue just moments before, darkened with a terrifying and unnatural speed. Thick, bruised gray clouds rolled over the jagged peaks, sealing the valley floor in a sudden, premature twilight. The temperature plummeted 10 degrees in a matter of minutes, chilling the sweat on the necks of the searchers. Small, hard pellets of ice began to fall from the blackening sky, striking the granite ridge with sharp, rhythmic taps that sounded like scattering nails. The lead rescue coordinator knew the brutal protocol for sudden mountain weather. A squall moving this fast in the upper basin could easily trap, freeze, and kill an entire team of experienced men. Reluctantly, with a heavy heart, he keyed his radio and gave the absolute order to abandon the ridge and fall back to the staging area. The men cast one last, long look at the single, final boot print resting alone in the frost before turning away and beginning the dangerous descent. By the time they reached the safety of the lower tree line, the snow was falling in heavy, blinding horizontal sheets. The unseasonal storm locked the mountain down for 3 full days, burying the high ridge under 4 feet of dense, heavy, wet snow. The weather effectively erased the strange trail, destroyed any remaining scent markers, and buried whatever evidence might have been left on the stone. When the deep thaw finally came weeks later, local rangers made one last quiet attempt to search the high areas of the basin. They did not find Elias. They did not find his remains, his missing clothing, or his other boot. They did, however, find one of the remote trail cameras he had gone out into the woods to check on that very first morning. It was strapped tightly to the trunk of an old birch tree about 1 mile south of where his footprints had inexplicably vanished. The plastic outer casing of the camera was deeply cracked, and the battery cover was missing, but the memory card sealed inside the waterproof housing was miraculously still intact. Investigators pulled the memory card and reviewed the digital footage in a locked, windowless room back at the local ranger station. According to the heavily redacted incident report later obtained by researchers, the camera had captured only a single, silent photograph at 2:45 p.m. on the day Elias disappeared. The image was incredibly grainy, shot in poor lighting under the dense, shadowing canopy of the pines. In the extreme foreground of the image, the very edge of Elias's heavy wool jacket was partially visible. It was slightly out of focus and blurred, capturing the exact moment he was walking past the hidden lens. But the true focus of the camera's automated sensor was drawn to the distant background. Deep in the dark, tangled timber, perfectly aligned with the direction Elias was walking, the shapes of the ancient trees appeared strangely distorted and bent. The shadows in the photograph did not match the natural angle of the afternoon sun. Instead, the darkness seemed to pool together into a single, unnatural, towering shape that stood between the trees, appearing to absorb all the ambient light around it. There were no distinct facial features, no reflections of eyes, and no recognizable outline of a natural animal. It was just a profound, empty, towering mass of darkness standing perfectly still among the pines, waiting on the exact path that Elias was walking toward. The case of the missing surveyor remains officially open, filed quietly under unexplained local disappearances. The dense woods surrounding the upper basin were eventually closed to casual hikers, with the state citing dangerously unstable terrain and deeply unpredictable weather patterns as the official reason. But those who have lived in the shadow of the valley for generations still talk quietly about the man who walked up the mountain and simply stepped off the face of the earth. The story has woven itself into the fabric of the local folklore, becoming a whispered warning passed down to young hunters. They say that sometimes, in the absolute dead of winter, when the biting wind completely drops and the ancient trees grow utterly, unnaturally silent, you can still find massive, wide, bounding footprints carved deeply into the fresh snow. Those foolish enough to track them follow the impossible strides for miles, winding through the darkest and most isolated parts of the forest until they finally reach an open clearing or a high, lonely ridge. And there, alone in the freezing, absolute silence, the tracks always stop. A case from 1998 in the Smoky Mountains was never closed. The dark green canvas backpack was found resting perfectly upright on a moss-covered log 7 miles off the designated trail. It was unzipped just enough to let the morning rain gather inside, yet the exterior remained unnaturally clean. There was no mud on the straps, no tear in the fabric from the dense thorns of the surrounding rhododendron thickets. It sat there in the heavy gray fog as if it had been placed by careful, deliberate hands only moments before the search team arrived. But there was no one around. There was only the endless, suffocating silence of the deep woods. The Great Smoky Mountains contain hollows and ravines that rarely see sunlight. In late October of 1998, the fog rolled through these valleys thick enough to swallow a person whole. A 32-year-old hiker traveling alone had walked into this mist 5 days earlier and simply ceased to exist. He had left no itinerary at the ranger station, only a brief note on the dashboard of his sedan parked near the trailhead. The note said he would return by Sunday evening. When Tuesday morning arrived with no sign of him, the search began. At first, the authorities treated it as a routine rescue operation. Hikers wander off the paths often. They twist ankles in the slick rocks, they lose their bearings in the sudden shifts of weather, they hunker down and wait for the flashlights of the search parties. But by the 4th day, the mood among the volunteers had shifted. The tracking dogs, usually reliable even in the damp mountain air, began to behave strangely. They would pull their handlers toward a specific ravine only to stop dead at the tree line, whine, and refuse to step any further into the brush. The discovery of the backpack on the 5th day was the first concrete piece of evidence. Inside, investigators found a spare wool sweater, a half-empty canteen, a topography map folded perfectly along its creases, and a single roll of 35mm film. There was no food, no compass, and no sleeping bag. The lead ranger noted in his report that the placement of the bag felt wrong. It was perched too precariously on the rotting log. A sudden gust of wind or the brush of a passing animal would have knocked it into the mud. It seemed staged, left behind as a marker for something the search party could not see. That evening, a severe storm grounded the helicopters and forced the search teams back to the staging area. The rain pounded the metal roof of the temporary command center, drowning out the static of the radio equipment. It was a miserable, cold night. Around 2:15 a.m., the radio operator caught a faint transmission on a closed channel used only by the park rangers. It was brief, just a few seconds of an open microphone. According to the official logs, there was no voice on the other end. There was only the rhythmic sound of a shovel striking soft, wet earth. Over and over, with a heavy, exhausted breathing layered underneath, the operator called out, asking for identification, assuming a ranger was out in the storm trying to free a trapped vehicle. The digging sound stopped. For a long moment, there was only the hiss of static. Then, a slow, deliberate click as the transmitter was turned off. The operator logged the event, feeling a sudden chill that he could not explain. The following morning, a specialized tracking team descended into the hollow where the backpack had been found. The rain had washed away most of the forest floor, turning it into a river of brown sludge. Yet, incredibly, they found footprints. They were isolated, appearing abruptly in a patch of soft clay near a swollen creek. But the stride of the prints was unnatural. The distance between the left foot and the right was nearly 6 feet. No human could walk with a stride that wide without running, yet the depth of the impressions suggested a slow, agonizingly heavy walk. The footprints did not trail off, they simply stopped. The final print was sunk deep into the clay, right at the edge of a sheer drop-off that plummeted 70 feet into a gorge of jagged slate. The searchers peered over the edge, expecting to find a broken body at the bottom, but there was nothing. No torn branches, no disturbed rocks, no blood, just the rushing water of the creek far below. A photographer with the search unit took 3 Polaroid pictures of the strange tracks. He placed them in a manila folder, sealing it with standard evidence tape. The folder was handed over to the chief investigator and locked in the evidence safe at the main ranger station that afternoon. The investigation was moving from a rescue mission to something much darker, though no one wanted to say it out loud. 3 days later, 2 local hunters who had joined the search effort reported finding a campsite. It was located an impossible 14 miles deep into the park in a sector of wilderness that was virtually impenetrable due to deadfall and briars. It took an entire afternoon for a ranger team to hack their way through the underbrush to reach the coordinates. What they found defied all logical explanation. A small single-person tent was set up in a small clearing, but it was not on the ground. The tent was suspended nearly 30 feet in the air, wedged tightly into the thick branches of an ancient oak tree. It was perfectly pitched, the nylon pulled taut, the stakes driven deep into the thick, rotting bark of the upper limbs. To assemble a tent with such precision on the ground was standard. To do it suspended 30 feet above the forest floor without ropes or climbing gear was something else entirely. A climber was brought in to scale the oak and inspect the tent. The rest of the team waited below in the silence of the growing dusk. According to the climber's statement, the zipper of the tent was secured from the outside. When he carefully pulled it open, shining his flashlight into the dark nylon cavity, he found it completely empty. But it was not undisturbed. The floor of the suspended tent was covered in a thick layer of crushed, dry autumn leaves, arranged perfectly into the shape of a sleeping human figure. The unnerving discoveries began to take a toll on the search teams. Volunteers stopped showing up, rumors began to circulate in the surrounding towns. Locals spoke of the old legends of the mountains, of things that lived deep in the hollows that could mimic the shapes of the lost. The police officially dismissed these rumors, focusing instead on the tangible evidence gathered so far. But the tangible evidence was about to become a problem. The lead investigator requested the manila folder containing the Polaroid photographs of the bizarre footprints. He unlocked the secure safe at the station, a safe to which only 3 people had the combination. He pulled out the folder. The evidence tape was still perfectly sealed. The signature across the seam was unbroken, but when he cut the tape with his pocket knife and opened the folder, it was empty. The photographs were gone. There was no logical way they could have been removed without tearing the envelope or breaking the seal. Confusion gave way to quiet panic within the precinct. The investigator immediately went to the audio archives to retrieve the cassette tape recording of the strange 2 a.m. radio transmission. He found the labeled plastic case sitting neatly on its designated shelf. He opened it, ready to play the sound of the digging for a newly assigned detective. The case contained a completely blank cassette. The tape had been entirely unspooled and cut out, leaving only the clear plastic reels. Pieces of the case were vanishing. It was as if the mountain itself was reaching into the concrete walls of the station and erasing the proof of what had happened. Paranoia set in among the staff. Accusations of tampering were whispered in the hallways, but no one could explain how or why a deputy would steal a photo of a footprint or a recording of static. The final piece of evidence remained: the single roll of 35mm film found in the abandoned backpack. It had been sent to a secure lab in a neighboring county to be developed, far away from the local station. A week after the search had stalled, a plain envelope arrived on the investigator's desk containing the developed photographs. There were 24 exposures on the roll. The first 22 were completely black. The lab technicians noted that the lens cap must have been on, or the photos were taken in absolute darkness without a flash. But the final 2 photographs contained images. The investigator laid them out on his desk under the harsh fluorescent light of his office. The 23rd photograph was taken in the woods, clearly at night. The harsh glare of the camera flash illuminated a thick wall of briars and twisted rhododendron branches. But slightly off-center, partially obscured by the leaves, was a figure. It was incredibly tall, easily over 7 feet, wrapped entirely in dark, wet canvas. It had no discernible face, just a pale, smooth surface where features should have been. It stood perfectly still among the thorns, facing the camera. The 24th photograph was the most disturbing. It was taken from a low angle, pointing straight up into the canopy of a massive oak tree. The flash caught the underside of a nylon tent suspended high in the branches. But the tent was not empty in this picture. A heavy, dark shape pressed against the thin nylon floor from the inside, bowing the material downward. And hanging by a single strap from a branch just below the tent, swinging slightly in the blurred exposure of the camera, was the hiker's dark green canvas backpack. The investigator stared at the photographs for hours. They contradicted everything the search team had found. The backpack had been discovered miles away from the suspended tent, resting on a log. If the backpack was in the tree when the photo was taken, who had moved it to the log, cleaned it, and left it for the rangers to find, and more importantly, who was operating the camera? He locked the 2 photographs in his desk drawer, intending to drive them to the Federal Bureau the next morning. He locked his office door. He walked out to his car in the quiet, damp evening air, feeling the weight of the dark mountains pressing down on the small town. He did not sleep that night. He listened to the wind rattling the window panes of his house, imagining the sound of a shovel biting into wet earth. When he returned to his office at 7:30 the next morning, his door was still locked. He sat at his desk, drank his coffee, and unlocked the bottom drawer to retrieve the photographs. The drawer was empty, there was no sign of forced entry, the locks had not been picked. The photographs, the final piece of physical evidence connecting the missing hiker to the strange anomalies in the woods, were simply gone. A thorough internal investigation yielded nothing. Polygraphs were administered to the staff, the station was searched from top to bottom, but the evidence was gone, just like the hiker. Without proof, the case grew cold. The search was officially suspended in November. The harsh winter snows covered the Great Smoky Mountains, burying the ravines and the hollows under feet of freezing white drift. By the spring of 1999, the missing man was declared legally dead. The case file was archived in a basement room filled with blank spaces and missing addendums. The official narrative was that a man wandered off the trail, succumbed to the elements, and his remains were likely scavenged by wildlife. It was a clean, logical story that the public could accept. But those who had been in the woods during those 5 days knew the truth was much darker. They remembered the wide, unnatural footprints. They remembered the empty tent suspended in the canopy. and the investigator remembered the pale, featureless face staring through the briars in a photograph that no longer existed. The case was never closed. It remains open, a silent stain on the records of the national park. The missing man's car was eventually towed away, the rust already eating at its edges. The woods reclaimed the paths cleared by the search teams. The ancient oak tree still stands somewhere deep in the hollows, its upper branches thick and twisted. According to local reports, hikers who wander too far off the trail in that specific sector still hear strange things when the fog rolls in. They speak of the sudden, suffocating silence that falls over the forest, a quiet so absolute it makes their ears ring. And occasionally, very late at night, campers claim to hear the rhythmic, distant sound of a shovel striking wet earth, digging a hole that no one will ever find. The Pogo Clown's Crawlspace. The suburbs of Chicago in the 1970s were a portrait of American stability. Neatly paved streets, freshly painted fences, and the quiet assurance that hard work yielded a comfortable life. On Somerdale Avenue in Des Plaines, this ideal was embodied by a successful contractor. He was a precinct captain, a charismatic neighbor who threw lavish summer barbecues, and a man who volunteered his weekends to entertain sick children dressed as Pogo the Clown. But beneath the veneer of civic duty and neighborly warmth, beneath the very floorboards of his sprawling brick ranch house, a suffocating darkness was taking root. It did not begin with a sight or a sound. It began with a smell. At first, the odor was subtle. It was a heavy, damp presence that seemed to cling to the lower edges of the rooms. The contractor's wife would walk through her kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon and catch a faint, sickeningly sweet waft drifting up from the heating vents. It did not smell like common household garbage. It was an oily, thick scent, reminiscent of spoiled meat left too long in the sun, mixed with the chalky, bitter chemical tang of quicklime. It was the kind of smell that coats the back of the throat and settles deep in the lungs. When she questioned him, John Wayne Gacy remained perfectly calm. He did not flinch or grow defensive. With the smooth, reassuring cadence of a seasoned salesman, he offered logical explanations. The house was built on a high water table, he told her. It was simply moisture building up in the dark, unventilated earth of the crawlspace. Or perhaps, he suggested with a casual shrug, a stray cat or a rat had crawled under the foundation during a cold snap and died. To fix it, he hauled dozens of bags of powdered lime into the house, dragging them down the hallway to the small access hatch in the floor. The access hatch was a small, unassuming square of wood that led down into a claustrophobic nightmare. The crawlspace was not a basement. It was a tight, oppressive gap between the floor joists and the raw earth, offering only a few feet of clearance. A man could not stand down there. He had to crouch, dragging himself through the cold, damp mud on his hands and knees. In the absolute darkness of that cramped void, the air was entirely still, thick with the heat of decomposition. Over the years, Gacy descended into this lightless pocket of earth again and again, armed with a short-handled shovel. He carved shallow trenches into the soil, forcing limp, lifeless forms into spaces too small to hold them, folding limbs to make them fit, and burying them under a thick snowfall of corrosive lime. Above ground, the charade of normalcy continued, creating a grotesque juxtaposition that defied comprehension. In the height of summer, usually around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Gacy would host his legendary backyard barbecues. Hundreds of guests would arrive. There were local politicians, distinguished police officers, and successful business owners, all mingling under the warm afternoon sun. They drank cold beer, played horseshoes on the lawn, and laughed at Gacy's loud, boisterous jokes. Is less than hash-hone. Zero hash is greater than. Gacy would stand at the large outdoor grill wearing an apron, skillfully flipping burgers and steaks. The rich, savory smoke of cooking meat would billow across the yard, masking the faint, persistent odor rising from the ground below. As the guests stood on the patio, making small talk and enjoying the suburban twilight, they were completely oblivious. They were standing on a graveyard. Just inches below the soles of their expensive shoes, Separated only by a thin layer of topsoil and concrete, lay the rotting remains of young men. 29 bodies were packed into the earth beneath the property, slowly dissolving into the mud while the party carried on above them. But as the years passed, the crawl space grew crowded. The earth could no longer absorb the volume of the dead. By 1977, the sickening sweetness in the house became impossible to ignore. In the dead of winter, when the bitter Illinois wind forced the family to close all the windows and turn on the furnace, the horror amplified. The heating system acted as an exhaust pipe for the tomb below. The warm air pushed the concentrated, putrid stench of mass decay up through the floor registers, filling the bedrooms, the living room, and the kitchen with the undeniable smell of death. The scent permeated the furniture. It settled into the fabric of the curtains and the fibers of the carpets. The wife burned candles constantly, leaving windows cracked open despite the freezing temperatures, desperate to scrub the foulness from her home. Gacy brought in industrial deodorizers and fans, complaining loudly about the poor drainage system. He continued to pour hundreds of pounds of lime down the hatch. He maintained his mask of irritation, acting as the frustrated homeowner dealing with a stubborn structural issue. He would put on his clown makeup, paint a wide red smile over his face, and head out to parties, leaving his family to breathe in the exhalations of his victims. The claustrophobia of the house became psychological as well as physical. The air was thick, suffocating, and heavy with an unspoken dread. Neighbors began to notice the strange, pungent odor wafting from the property when the wind blew in a certain direction. They too accepted the story of the broken sump pump and the damp earth. No one wanted to believe that the cheerful man who fixed their sidewalks and hosted their block parties was capable of anything sinister. The human mind naturally rejects the unimaginable, preferring to believe in dead rats rather than murdered boys. The illusion finally collapsed in the freezing final days of 1978. Investigators, looking into the disappearance of a local teenager, executed a search warrant on the house at 8213 Summerdale. When a detective stood in the living room, feeling the warm air blow from a heating vent, the smell hit him. It was a scent no seasoned officer could mistake for a dead animal or a moisture problem. It was the distinct, unmistakable odor of human putrefaction. They pulled up the access panel. A technician lowered himself into the dark, incredibly tight space beneath the house. The heat down there was unnatural, generated by the chemical reaction of the lime and the biological process of dozens of bodies breaking down in the soil. As the technician swept away a thin layer of dirt and white powder, his trowel struck something hard. It was not a pipe, and it was not a stone. It was a human femur. What followed was a slow, agonizing excavation. The crawl space was so heavily packed with remains that investigators struggled to tell where one trench ended and another began. The earth was saturated. The claustrophobia of the site meant officers had to work in agonizingly cramped positions, breathing through heavy masks, carefully removing the victims one by one from the dark mud. They uncovered 29 bodies in that tight, airless void beneath the floorboards, a silent congregation trapped in the dark while the world walked above them. The house was eventually demolished, erased from the manicured landscape of Summerdale Avenue. The lot was left vacant, a patch of empty grass standing in stark contrast to the identical homes surrounding it. But the memory of that suffocating house remains a permanent scar on the neighborhood. For those who lived there, who attended the parties, and who breathed the air in that living room, the horror lingers. It is the realization of how thin the floorboards truly are, and how easily a monster can hide his darkness behind a painted smile and a neighborly wave, burying his secrets in the shallow earth while the rest of the world turns a blind eye. A Dartmoor report described a voice that matched his wife. Exactly. It was 2:15 in the morning when the man stood completely still in his dark kitchen, listening to his wife call for help from the edge of the woods. Her voice was trembling, cutting through the dense fog that rolled off the tree line, begging him to open the back door. The sound was distinct and terrified, carrying the exact pitch and slight rasp she always had when she was frightened. But he did not reach for the deadbolt. He kept his hand pressed flat against the cold wood of the doorframe, his breathing shallow, because he could hear the steady, rhythmic breathing of his actual wife drifting down the stairs from their second-floor bedroom. The property sat at the end of a long, unpaved gravel road in Dartmoor County, a deeply rural stretch of the Pacific Northwest known for its oppressive weather and vast, unbroken tracts of pine forest. According to local records, the area had always struggled with a spotty telephone network and a peculiar acoustic phenomenon. Sound traveled strangely across the damp valleys. A falling tree could sound like a gunshot, and the wind moving through the ravines often mimicked the drone of a low-flying airplane. But the voice filtering through the glass of the kitchen door was not a trick of the wind, it was a precise, flawless replication of a human voice layered with artificial emotion. The man, whose name was detailed in later police reports only as Thomas, remained in the dark. Outside, the pleading continued. The voice repeated the same 3 phrases in a loop. It asked him to come outside, it said it was cold, it said it had lost the flashlight. Thomas realized with a sinking sickness that these were the exact phrases his wife had used 3 years earlier during a camping trip in another state when she had briefly lost her way near their tent. The cadence was perfectly preserved, like an audio recording pressed into the damp night air. A heavy silence fell over the yard. The voice stopped mid-sentence, cutting off abruptly without any natural fade or intake of breath. Thomas pressed his cheek against the frosted glass of the back window, peering out into the impenetrable blackness. There was no movement near the tree line. The motion sensor light attached to the garage, which was sensitive enough to trigger when a stray deer wandered past, remained completely dark. Yet, he could hear the unmistakable sound of wet leaves compressing under heavy, deliberate footsteps. They were moving closer to the house, but the rhythm was entirely wrong. It sounded like something walking on 2 legs, but the steps were spaced too far apart, dragging slightly with every second stride. According to the incident report filed days later, Thomas finally backed away from the door and retrieved a heavy steel flashlight from the kitchen counter. He did not turn it on. He moved silently through the first floor, checking the locks on the heavy oak front door and the sliding glass panels in the living room. Every window was secured. As he stood in the center of the living room, surrounded by the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the adjacent room, a new sound began. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping against the glass of the living room window. Thomas froze. The window was located on the side of the house where the ground dropped away into a steep ravine. To reach that glass from the outside, a person would need to be standing on a tall ladder, or they would have to be nearly 9 feet tall. The tapping continued, patient and unhurried. Then the voice returned, but it was no longer screaming, it was whispering right against the external pane of glass. It whispered Thomas's name over and over, mirroring the gentle, sleepy tone his wife used when waking him up in the morning. The history of Dartmoor County is scattered with strange, fragmented reports of auditory anomalies. Archival newspaper clippings from the 1970s describe loggers walking off their job sites, claiming they heard their foreman calling them into deep, unmarked sections of the forest. In 1992, a search and rescue team spent 3 days looking for a missing hiker because they kept hearing his voice echoing from the bottom of a limestone gorge. When they finally found the man, he had been deceased for over 48 hours, making it medically impossible for him to have been shouting for help that morning. These incidents were often rationalized as echo delays or the stress-induced auditory hallucinations of exhausted searchers. But standing in his living room, Thomas knew he was not hallucinating. The whisper against the glass was too tactile, too physically present. The condensation on the outside of the window seemed to blur, disturbed by hot breath. Slowly, Thomas raised the heavy flashlight and clicked the beam on, aiming it directly at the window. The bright circle of light illuminated the swirling fog and the bare branches of an oak tree. There was nothing standing outside the glass. The air was empty. But the whispering did not stop. It simply shifted. the source of the sound moving rapidly along the exterior wall, traveling faster than a human could run. The voice slid along the vinyl siding, moving toward the front porch. Thomas tracked the sound from the inside, his heart pounding a heavy rhythm against his ribs. He heard the wooden planks of the porch groan under a sudden, immense weight. Then came the sound of the front door handle jiggling. It was a violent, frantic rattling, as if someone was desperately trying to force the lock. Thomas raised the flashlight like a weapon, bracing himself. Over the noise of the rattling handle, a new voice spoke. It was deep, panicked, and distinctly male. It was his own voice. The voice outside the door was screaming to let him in. It was a flawless imitation of Thomas shouting for his wife, demanding she unlock the door and call 911. Thomas listened to himself panic. He listened to the exact timbre of his own terror, a terror he was currently feeling but had not yet voiced aloud. The mimicry was so uncanny that for a fleeting, disorienting second, Thomas felt a severe detachment from his own body. He wondered wildly if he was the one trapped outside in the freezing fog, and the thing standing inside the dark hallway was the imposter. Up on the second floor, a floorboard creaked. Thomas snapped out of his paralyzing trance. The noise outside the front door vanished instantly, plunging the house back into suffocating silence. He heard his wife's footsteps moving slowly down the carpeted stairs. She called out his name, her voice thick with sleep and confusion. Thomas immediately warned her to stay back, to stay on the stairs. He kept his flashlight trained on the front door, the solid wood suddenly looking very fragile. She asked him what was going on, why he was standing in the dark. He did not know how to explain that he had just spent 20 minutes listening to both of them beg for their lives from the other side of the walls. They sat together on the floor of the upstairs hallway until dawn, the bedroom door locked, waiting for the sun to burn off the fog. The local police arrived shortly after 8 o'clock in the morning. 2 deputies walked the perimeter of the house while Thomas and his wife watched from the kitchen window. The officers found no signs of forced entry. The locks were intact, the glass was undisturbed, and the motion sensor lights were confirmed to be in perfect working order. However, the official police report noted one peculiar detail that the deputies could not easily dismiss. In the damp soil beneath the living room window, the window that overlooked the steep drop-off into the ravine, there were deep impressions in the mud. They were not footprints, they were long, smooth drag marks, as if something incredibly heavy and completely lacking limbs had pulled itself back and forth beneath the glass. The marks stretched all the way around the foundation of the house, leading up the steps to the front porch, and eventually disappearing into the thick brush at the edge of the tree line. Desperate for proof that they were not losing their grip on reality, Thomas purchased a digital audio recorder from an electronics store 50 miles away. He placed it on the wooden railing of the front porch, wrapped in a plastic bag to protect it from the creeping dampness of the fog. He set it to activate only when it detected a sound louder than a whisper. For 3 nights, the device captured nothing but the low hum of the wind and the occasional patter of freezing rain against the wooden deck. On the 4th morning, the digital display indicated that 42 minutes of audio had been recorded between the hours of 3 a.m. and 4 o'clock in the morning. Thomas and his wife sat at the kitchen table, sunlight streaming through the windows, and pressed play. At first, there was only static. Then, the distinct crunch of gravel. Something heavy was dragging itself up the driveway. The sound was wet, accompanied by a low, rhythmic wheezing that did not sound remotely biological. Then, the voices began. It was not just Thomas and his wife. The recorder had captured a chaotic, layered chorus of conversations. They heard a mail carrier they had spoken to weeks ago asking about a stray dog. They heard a neighbor complaining about a fallen tree. They heard the 911 dispatcher from the night of the first incident repeating her calm, practiced instructions on a loop. The entity outside was practicing. It was sifting through an archive of stolen sounds, testing syllables, adjusting its pitch, searching for the frequency that would compel someone to unlock the door. The most disturbing part of the recording came at the very end. The layered voices abruptly cut out, leaving a hollow, dead silence. Then, a voice spoke directly into the microphone. It was impossibly close, the breathing heavily distorted by the plastic bag. It was the voice of Thomas's wife humming a tuneless, repetitive melody. It was a melody she only ever hummed while she was completely alone, folding laundry in the basement. The entity had been listening to them long before it ever made itself known. The illusion of safety shattered permanently on a Tuesday evening in late November. The sun had set early, casting long, bruised shadows across the yard. Thomas's wife was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, while Thomas was in the basement organizing a set of tools. The basement was unfinished, a cavernous space of exposed concrete and damp earth, lit by a single bulb swinging from a wire. As he sorted through a box of nails, he heard her call down the wooden stairs. She asked him to come up and look at something outside the window. Her voice was calm, casual, lacking any trace of alarm. Thomas dropped a handful of nails back into the box and began walking toward the staircase. He had his foot on the bottom step when his cell phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was a text message from his wife. It read that she had just driven into town to pick up milk from the grocery store and would be back in 20 minutes. Thomas stared at the glowing screen, the cold air of the basement suddenly feeling like ice against his skin. From the top of the dark staircase, the voice spoke again. It repeated the exact same phrase with the exact same casual intonation. It asked him to come up and look at something outside. Thomas did not answer. He slowly backed away from the stairs, retreating into the shadows of the concrete walls. He realized that the voice was not coming from the kitchen. It was coming from the narrow gap beneath the door at the top of the stairs, vibrating through the wood with an unnatural, mechanical precision. He stood in the damp darkness for what felt like hours, gripping a heavy iron wrench in his right hand. Above him, the pacing began. It was not the sound of dragging, but the heavy, deliberate thud of boots walking across the hardwood floor of the kitchen. The footsteps matched Thomas's own gait perfectly. He listened as the entity moved through their home, opening cabinets, running the faucet, mimicking the mundane sounds of a quiet evening. It was playing house. It was wearing their routine like a stolen piece of clothing. When the headlights of his wife's car finally swept across the driveway, the footsteps above him abruptly stopped. Thomas heard the front door open, heard his wife calling out a greeting, the rustle of paper grocery bags being set on the counter. He waited for another voice to answer her. He waited for a scream, but there was only silence, followed by her footsteps walking toward the basement door. She opened it and called down, asking why he was sitting in the dark. Her voice was real. The air in the house had returned to normal. They moved out of Dartmoor County exactly 4 days later. They broke their lease, packed only what could fit in the back of their vehicle, and left the heavy furniture behind. They never returned to collect the rest. The property sat vacant for years, slowly being reclaimed by the aggressive overgrowth of the Pacific Northwest. The windows became clouded with grime, and the roof eventually sagged under the weight of accumulated pine needles. But the legend of the Dartmoor mimic remains a quietly discussed topic among the locals who live near the state forest. Hikers are strictly advised to stay on marked trails and to never venture into the woods alone. The warning is not just for the risk of getting lost or encountering wildlife, it is because of the reports that still occasionally surface at the local ranger station. Reports of hikers hearing their own names called from the bottom of deep ravines, reports of missing campers whose voices are heard crying out in the fog, weeks after the search operations have been officially suspended. There is one detail from Thomas's final police report that locals rarely mention to outsiders. When he finally walked upstairs that night, after his wife had returned from the store, he noticed something resting on the kitchen counter. Next to the paper grocery bags was the heavy steel flashlight he had used during the first incident weeks prior. He had left it on his bedside table that morning, but there it sat, perfectly centered on the counter, still cold to the touch. The entity had not just mimicked their voices, it had left a quiet, mocking proof that it had been inside all along, watching them learn how to be afraid. An Idaho fire tower report from 2003 was never released. The final entry in the publicly released logbook for the Black Mountain Fire Tower simply read, "Weather clear, visibility 10 miles, no smoke detected." But according to internal forestry documents leaked nearly 2 decades later, The actual handwritten log from August 9th, 2003 did not end there. It continued for another 14 pages, cataloging a sequence of events that began at 11:45 p.m. The missing pages did not describe a forest fire, a trespassing hiker, or a sudden storm. Instead, the observer, stationed at the tower, documented an encounter that began with the ambient sound of the forest abruptly and completely ceasing. The Black Mountain Tower stood 65 feet above a dense, unbroken canopy in the remote reaches of the Clearwater National Forest. It was a standard architectural design for the region, a glass-walled box measuring roughly 14 by 14 feet, accessible only by a steep, exposed wooden staircase. The lookout on duty that summer was a 24-year-old seasonal employee. His name was redacted in all the leaked files, referred to only as the Observer. For the first 6 weeks of his post, his reports were entirely routine, filled with mundane details about humidity, wind speed, and distant lightning strikes. But the August 9th entry shifted in tone almost immediately after nightfall, noting a sudden drop in temperature and a strange, localized fog creeping through the pines directly below his structure. By midnight, the Observer reported that his two-way radio had begun emitting a rhythmic, low-frequency pulse. He wrote that he initially assumed it was atmospheric interference and attempted to contact the regional dispatcher. The channel, however, was completely choked by a thick, heavy static. He noted in his log that the pulse sounded biological, like a slow, amplified heartbeat broadcasting directly over the emergency frequency. He turned the volume down, but the vibration of the speaker still rattled against the wooden desk. Seeking the source of the interference, he stepped out onto the narrow metal catwalk that surrounded the glass cabin. The air outside was dead calm. There was no wind to move the trees, yet the Observer claimed he could hear the distinct sound of heavy branches snapping in the dark, roughly 200 feet below his position. The logbook described the Observer retrieving a high-powered, handheld spotlight from his supply locker. He leaned over the railing and swept the bright beam over the tree line, expecting to catch the reflective eyes of a black bear or a stray elk wandering through the underbrush. Instead, the beam illuminated a patch of the forest floor where the shadows simply did not behave correctly. According to his written account, a cluster of tall, pale shapes stood perfectly still among the dark trunks of the pines. They were thin, much taller than any human, and blended almost seamlessly with the pale bark of the birch trees. The Observer noted with a clinical, terrifying detachment that the figures were completely hairless and unnaturally smooth. When the harsh light hit them, they did not scatter or flinch. They simply leaned backward, slipping out of the illuminated circle with a smooth, liquid motion that defied the anatomy of any known animal. At 1:15 a.m., the Observer wrote that the pulsing sound on the radio had finally stopped. It was immediately replaced by a faint, wet clicking noise coming from outside the glass walls. He turned off all the lanterns inside the cabin, plunging himself into total darkness so his eyes could adjust to the moonlight and he could see the catwalk. The narrow metal walkway was empty, but the clicking continued. It sounded like long, hardened fingernails tapping rhythmically against the wooden support beams holding the massive tower aloft. The sound was not stationary, it was slowly, methodically moving upward. 10 feet off the ground, 20 feet, 30 feet. Something was climbing the sheer wooden structure, but it was entirely avoiding the wooden stairs. The Observer documented his own rising panic with a strange, methodical precision, as if relying on protocol was the only way to maintain his sanity. He recorded the exact time he secured the heavy trapdoor that covered the stairwell entrance. He noted checking the locks on the heavy glass doors on all four sides of the cabin. A few minutes later, he wrote that the thick timber framing of the tower was beginning to groan under an immense shifting weight. Whatever was scaling the exterior was heavy enough to make the 65-foot structure sway slightly, mimicking the motion it usually made only in gale force winds. Yet, the night outside remained perfectly still. There was no breeze to stir the pines. There was only the creaking wood and the relentless, wet clicking ascending the eastern supports. At 2:30 a.m., the tapping stopped just below the edge of the catwalk. The observer sat perfectly still in the center of the dark room, gripping a heavy flashlight, waiting for a face to appear in the windows. For nearly 10 minutes, there was absolute, suffocating silence. Then, a voice spoke from the darkness outside the reinforced glass. The logbook recorded that the voice belonged to the regional dispatcher, the familiar woman who took his daily weather reports. But the dispatcher was stationed at a secure facility more than 30 miles away. Furthermore, the voice lacked any human inflection or breath. It simply repeated the phrase, "Observer status check, observer status check," over and over, with the flat, mechanical cadence of a skipping audio recording. The observer did not answer the voice. He remained motionless on the floorboards, barely daring to breathe. He wrote that when he failed to respond, the voice outside began to change. It distorted, deepening into a hollow, metallic drone, though it continued to repeat the exact same phrase. A few moments later, a second voice joined it from the western side of the catwalk. This one sounded like a young child crying softly, a sound that had no logical place in the middle of a remote wilderness in the dead of night. Then a third voice joined the chorus, flawlessly mimicking the rhythmic, low-frequency pulse he had heard earlier on his radio. A chaotic symphony of impossible sounds drifted through the thin glass panes surrounding the cabin entirely. The observer realized they were trying to provoke a response, attempting to trick him into speaking so they could pinpoint his exact location within the dark room. At 3:14 a.m., the observer managed to write his second-to-last entry. The handwriting had become shaky, the letters pressed deeply into the paper. He wrote that a face had finally pressed itself against the glass on the northern side of the cabin. He could only see its outline in the dim moonlight. He described it as impossibly long, pale, and completely smooth, entirely lacking eyes, a nose, or any discernible human features. It had only a wide, dark fissure where a mouth should be. As he watched in paralyzed horror, a long, multi-jointed hand reached up into view and began testing the brass handle of the outer door. The handle turned slowly, clanking heavily against the locked mechanism. The creature did not try to force the door open or break the glass. It simply stood there, patiently testing the lock, while the stolen voices continued to murmur endlessly from the surrounding darkness. The final page of the unredacted logbook contained only a few hurried sentences logged at 3:43 a.m. The handwriting had devolved into a frantic, nearly illegible scrawl. The observer noted that the deep structural groaning of the tower had returned, but this time it was coming from all four sides simultaneously. There was not just one of them waiting outside. The wet clicking filled the air, vibrating violently through the floorboards beneath his boots. The final sentence on the page was heavily underlined. It simply read, "They know the glass is fragile, they are tapping the panes." When the scheduled relief crew arrived 2 days later, the Black Mountain Tower was empty. There was no sign of a struggle, the furniture was undisturbed, and no trace of blood or damage was found inside the cabin. The heavy wooden trapdoor was still securely locked from the inside, meaning whoever left had not used the stairs. The glass windows were entirely intact, but the relief crew noted they were covered in an oily, translucent residue on the outside, spanning from the floor to the roofline. The Forestry Service never publicly identified the substance. The observer's personal belongings, including his keys and wallet, were still neatly packed in his duffel bag beneath the cot. The official report filed by the agency later that month stated that the young man had simply walked off the job, abandoning his post to hike back to civilization due to severe isolation fatigue. The unredacted logbook pages remained buried in classified archives until a Freedom of Information request accidentally uncovered them nearly 2 decades later. The Forestry Service immediately issued a brief statement dismissing the handwritten pages as a creative writing exercise, claiming they were merely a symptom of the observer's declining mental state during his long deployment. But former rangers who worked the Black Mountain District during that era have long shared quiet rumors about the events of that summer. They frequently point out that the fire tower was permanently decommissioned and completely dismantled just 3 weeks after the disappearance, an expensive and unusual procedure for a fully functional structure. And local hikers still whisper about certain windless nights deep in the Clearwater Forest when the woods fall dead silent, and the trees seem to echo with the faint sound of a hollow, lifeless voice endlessly asking for a status check. Attacked at the Sally House. The limestone walls of Atchison, Kansas hold a coldness that the prairie sun cannot reach. In this small town where the Missouri River winds like a slow, dark ribbon, stands a modest brick house on North 2nd Street. To a passing stranger, it looks like a relic of the late 19th century, sturdy, unassuming, and quiet. But the air around the property feels heavy, as if the oxygen has been replaced by the weight of a 100-year-old secret. Inside, the shadows do not behave according to the laws of light. They cling to the corners of the ceiling, and they watch. They are waiting for a specific kind of guest. They are waiting for the men. The legend of the Sally House is not one of a vengeful widow or a spectral soldier, but of a child. According to the documented lore of the town, the haunting traces back to a young girl named Sally who died on the operating table in the front room of this very house. In the early 1900s, the home served as the residence and office of a local physician. Sally was brought there by her frantic mother, suffering from a severe case of appendicitis. The doctor, fearing the organ would rupture, did not wait for the anesthesia to take full effect. Sally's final moments in the world of the living were defined by the cold bite of a scalpel and a blinding, white-hot agony. She died believing the man trying to save her was the man who was torturing her. For decades, the house remained relatively quiet, a slumbering vessel for a trauma that refused to dissipate. It wasn't until the early 1990s that the house truly woke up. A young couple, Tony and Deborah Pickman, moved into the residence, unaware that they were stepping into a territorial battleground. From the very first night, the atmosphere shifted. The temperature would plummet in the nursery, dropping 20 degrees in a matter of seconds. Strange smells, the metallic scent of blood, and the sterile odor of old medicine would waft through the hallways. But the entity in the house wasn't interested in Deborah. It had fixed its sights on Tony. The escalation began with subtle pranks. Objects would move across the kitchen table when Tony was alone. He would hear the soft, rhythmic patter of small feet running across the floorboards upstairs, followed by a giggle that sounded less like a child and more like a warning. Then came the physical contact. It started as a phantom touch, a cold hand brushing against his neck in the middle of the night. But as the weeks passed, the touch turned violent. The spirit of the little girl, or whatever was masquerading as her, began to manifest a visceral, burning hatred for the man of the house. During one dinner, while friends were visiting, Tony felt a sharp, stinging sensation across his back. He pulled up his shirt to reveal 3 long, bright red welts, as if a small hand with jagged nails had raked across his skin. There was no explanation. He hadn't been near anything sharp. The marks were fresh, weeping, and hot to the touch. This became the Sally House's signature. It was no longer a haunting of sightings and sounds. It was a haunting of physical assault. The entity was marking him, claiming his flesh as a canvas for its eternal resentment of the doctor who had failed it. One evening, at approximately 10:15 p.m., the activity reached a terrifying crescendo. Tony was in the basement, a dark, damp space with a dirt floor that seemed to swallow the light from his flashlight. The air down there was thick with the smell of wet earth and decay. He felt a sudden, oppressive pressure on his chest, making it difficult to breathe. He tried to turn back toward the stairs, but his feet felt heavy, as if he were walking through waist-deep water. Then, the burning started. It wasn't just a scratch this time. It felt like someone had pressed a branding iron against his torso. He cried out, stumbling toward the light of the kitchen above. When he reached the safety of the living room and lifted his shirt, his wife gasped. Across his chest were dozens of scratches, crisscrossing in a chaotic pattern. Some were thin and shallow, while others were deep enough to bead with blood. They formed a frantic, angry map of pain. As they watched, new marks began to appear in real time, appearing under the skin like invisible ink being heated by a flame. There was no one near him. The room was empty of anyone living, yet Tony was being shredded by unseen fingers. The horror angle of the Sally house is the realization that the entity isn't just a confused child. Investigators who have spent nights in the house describe a dual presence. There is the girl, Sally, who is often seen in a pinafore dress clutching a teddy bear, but behind her, or perhaps using her image as a mask, is something much older and more sinister. This darker force thrives on the fear of men. It watches from the top of the stairs, a shadow taller than any man, with eyes that do not reflect light. When male visitors enter the nursery, they often report a feeling of intense nausea, followed by the unmistakable sensation of being watched by something that wants to tear the skin from their bones. One investigator in the mid-90s recounted a session at 3 a.m. in the nursery. He sat in the center of the room with a tape recorder, asking questions into the silence. He felt a sudden, icy breeze pass through his hair. He joked nervously about the cold, trying to maintain his composure. Within seconds, he felt a violent shove against his shoulder that nearly knocked him off his chair. When he looked at his arm, he found a circular bruise already forming, the size of a small child's palm, but with a strength that suggested a muscular, adult force. The audio recording from that night captured a low, guttural growl that no human throat could produce, followed by a child's voice whispering a single word, "Get out." The house has a way of isolating its victims. Even when the room is full of people, the man being targeted feels as though he is in a void. The sounds of the outside world, the cars on North 2nd Street, the wind in the trees fade into a muffled hum. All that remains is the sound of his own heartbeat and the realization that he is being hunted in a space that should be a sanctuary. The scratches often appear in sets of 3, a mockery of the Holy Trinity that is common in demonic hauntings, suggesting that the little girl may be a facade for something far more predatory. By the time the Pickmans finally fled the house, Tony's body was a map of scars. He had suffered over 20 documented physical attacks. The scratches would often heal with unnatural speed, disappearing within 24 hours, only to be replaced by new ones the moment he stepped back across the threshold. The psychological toll was even greater. He began to have dreams of the operating table, feeling the phantom slice of the doctor's knife, experiencing the terror of a child who realizes the person meant to help them is the one causing the pain. Today, the Sally house remains a site of pilgrimage for those who wish to test their bravery, but the warnings remain unchanged. Women and children often walk through the rooms with nothing more than a slight chill or a sense of sadness. But for the men who dare to enter, the experience is different. They speak of a lingering dread that follows them home, a feeling of being marked. Some have reported finding scratches on their backs days after leaving Atchison, as if the entity had hitched a ride, waiting until they were vulnerable in their own beds to remind them of its presence. The house stands silent now, its dark windows reflecting the Kansas sky, but if you stand on the sidewalk long enough after the sun goes down, you might see a small shadow move past the upstairs window. You might hear the faint sound of a girl crying, or the heavy, rhythmic thud of something much larger pacing the floorboards. The limestone walls remember the screams of 1906, and the entity inside remembers the face of every man who has ever entered its domain. It is a house that does not forgive, and it is a house that never forgets the feel of skin beneath its claws. The creeping fog of the Appalachian Trail. The Appalachian Mountains hold a quiet arrogance, born of an age that the human mind can scarcely comprehend. They are some of the oldest peaks on Earth, worn down into rolling green ridges by hundreds of millions of years of wind and water. To the casual observer driving along the Blue Ridge Parkway, they are a picturesque tapestry of emerald forests and blue-tinted horizons. But to step off the paved roads and walk deep into the ancient timber, is to cross a threshold into a different world. Beneath the dense canopy of oak, hickory, and pine, the shadows lengthen, and the damp soil swallows the noise of the modern world. It is a place of immense beauty, but it is also a place that keeps its secrets buried deep within the roots of the forest. For decades, an unsettling pattern has woven itself into the fabric of the trail. Experienced hikers, mountaineers, and hunters have walked into these woods and simply vanished. The phenomenon, often categorized by researchers as the missing 411 cases, shares a series of chillingly consistent characteristics. These are not novices who wander off with inadequate gear. They are survivalists, trail runners, and veterans of the wilderness. They disappear in the blink of an eye, often leaving their equipment behind, and when search and rescue teams arrive, they find nothing. No tracks, no torn clothing, no signs of an animal attack. It is as if the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them whole, leaving behind a profound, suffocating emptiness. Consider the documented accounts from the deep sections of the Great Smoky Mountains in the autumn of 2015. A hiker, a man of 42, who had traversed the entire 2,190 miles of the trail twice before, set out for a brief 3-day trek. He carried a satellite beacon, topographical maps, and enough provisions to survive for a week. The weather forecast was clear, predicting crisp autumn sunshine and mild breezes. According to the lore gathered from those few who claim to have barely escaped similar encounters, the descent into terror does not begin with a roar, but with a whisper. It was early afternoon, perhaps 2:30 p.m., when the atmosphere shifted. The hiker had established a small camp in a clearing surrounded by ancient, towering pines. The sun was shining through the canopy, painting golden streaks across the forest floor. He walked away from his bright orange tent to collect dry firewood, carrying only his brass compass and a small hatchet. He took no more than 30 steps. Then, the air grew suddenly, unnervingly cold. The temperature plummeted by at least 20 degrees in a matter of seconds. The warmth of the sun was abruptly severed, replaced by a creeping, unnatural chill that settled into his bones. From the hollows beneath the ridge, a dense fog began to pour upward. It did not drift like natural mist. It moved with a deliberate, almost predatory intent. It was thick, a blinding, milky white vapor that rolled over the ferns and swallowed the trunks of the pines. Within a minute, the visibility was reduced to less than 5 feet. But the fog was only the visual manifestation of the nightmare. The true horror arrived with the silence. Researchers call it the Oz effect. One moment, the forest was alive with the chaotic symphony of nature. The chattering of squirrels, the rustling of dry leaves in the wind, the rhythmic chirping of insects, and the calls of songbirds overhead. The next moment, a heavy acoustic deadness slammed down over the woods. Every single sound ceased completely. The wind died, the insects went entirely mute. Even the sound of the hiker's own breathing seemed muffled, as if the air itself had turned into thick velvet. It was a sensory deprivation so absolute that it caused a profound, agonizing pressure in the inner ear. The forest was no longer a habitat. It felt like a tomb, and he was entirely alone inside it. Panic is an instinct that experienced survivalists are trained to suppress. The hiker stopped, took a deep breath, and turned around to walk the 30 steps back to his bright orange tent. He counted his paces: 10, 20, 30, 40. He stopped. There was no tent. There was no clearing. There were only endless, identical gray trunks of pine trees fading upward into the suffocating white mist. He had walked in a perfectly straight line, yet the topography around him seemed to have shifted entirely. He felt the distinct, sickening sensation of being watched. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and a primal alarm bell rang in the deepest part of his brain. Something massive, unseen, and hostile was observing him from just beyond the veil of the fog. He pulled the brass compass from his pocket, trusting the magnetic north over his own confused senses. He held it flat in his palm. The red needle did not point, it spun. It rotated in a slow, continuous circle unaffected by the Earth's magnetic field, as if the laws of physics had been suspended within this isolated pocket of the woods. The needle spun faster, clockwise, then abruptly jerked and spun counterclockwise. Spatial reality was unraveling. The hiker was no longer in the Great Smoky Mountains. He had stepped into a fractured layer of reality, a place not printed on any topographical map. Then the silence was broken, not by a bird nor the wind, but by a voice. It came from somewhere deep within the impenetrable fog, perhaps 50 yards to his left. "Hello?" the voice called out. The hiker froze, his blood running cold. It was not a stranger's voice, it was his own voice. The pitch, the cadence, the slight rasp of a dry throat, it was an absolutely perfect auditory mirror of his own vocal cords. The sound did not echo, it fell flat against the mist. A few seconds later, it called out again, this time from a different direction, behind him to his right. "Is anyone there?" it asked, mimicking the exact inflection he would have used if he were lost. The mimicry was bait. The intelligence behind the voice understood human psychology perfectly. It was trying to draw him away from his path, luring him deeper into the disorienting maze of the fog. The hiker knew, with the absolute certainty of a prey animal, that if he walked toward that voice, he would cross a boundary from which no living soul ever returns. He stood perfectly still, gripping the handle of his hatchet, surrounded by a forest that was actively hunting him. The trees seemed to close in, the trunks shifting silently closer whenever he blinked. The voice called out a third time, now just 10 feet away, whispering from right behind his shoulder, speaking his own name in his own voice. When the official search and rescue operation was launched 48 hours later, the weather had cleared, the sun was shining, the forest was loud with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. Over 50 volunteers, park rangers, and state police scoured the grid where the hiker had planned to camp. They found his bright orange tent exactly where he had pitched it. His backpack, his sleeping bag, and his satellite beacon were all inside, but there was no sign of the man. The most chilling detail of the official report was the behavior of the search dogs. 3 highly trained bloodhounds, dogs that had tracked escaped fugitives through swamps and found lost children in the darkest nights, were brought to the campsite. They were given the missing man's sleeping shirt for the scent. The handlers led them to the edge of the clearing, toward the tree line where the hiker had presumably gone to collect wood. The dogs hit an invisible wall. They planted their paws into the dirt, tucked their tails between their hind legs, and refused to move forward. They began to whine, a low, terrified sound backing away from the trees. One hound laid down in the dirt and began to violently shake, absolutely refusing to lift its nose to the wind. The dogs knew what the humans could not see. Whatever had taken the hiker was not natural, and the scent trail led into a nightmare they refused to enter. The case remains open, an unresolved file locked away in a cabinet, just one more name added to the vast, silent list of the missing 411. The Appalachian Trail remains open to the public. Every year, millions of hikers walk its paths, marveling at the ancient beauty of the rolling green ridges. They set up their tents, light their fires, and fall asleep under the stars. But those who know the lore never walk far from the light of their campfires. They know that the forest is old, that it is patient, and that sometimes, when the fog rolls in and the woods go completely silent, the mountain decides it is hungry. The man who knew too much about them in Los Angeles. By the time the second voicemail arrived, the family had already stopped answering unknown numbers. The first one had been strange enough. A man with a low, even voice had asked whether the hallway light had been fixed yet and whether the child was still afraid of the sound the pipes made after midnight. He spoke as if he had lived in the apartment with them, as if he knew the small, private discomforts that never left the walls. On the second message, he mentioned a broken dish that had not fallen yet and a visit from police that had not happened. He ended both calls the same way, with a pause so long it sounded like listening, and then a soft, almost thoughtful good night. The reports that later circulated in Los Angeles were always incomplete in the same frustrating way. They described a pattern without ever quite finding its center. According to people who spoke to investigators, the calls did not begin with threats, they began with knowledge. The caller knew which bedroom window stuck in humid weather. He knew which relative had recently moved away. He knew that one tenant kept a coffee mug by the sink with a hairline crack running through the handle. He knew what time the dog in the neighboring unit usually started scratching at the front door. These were not facts anyone would place online. They were not dramatic enough to be shared and too small to seem important until a stranger began saying them aloud. The family at the center of the case, or at least the family most often mentioned when the story is retold, had moved into an aging apartment building on a side street west of downtown. It was the sort of place that always looked tired even in full sun. The lobby smelled faintly of bleach, old paper, and rainwater trapped in concrete. The mailboxes rattled when buses passed. At night, the corridors took on that strange apartment stillness, where every tiny sound seemed to travel too far. Footsteps on another floor could seem close enough to belong to someone standing just outside the door. They were ordinary in the way many people become ordinary inside stories like this. A couple, a young child, a grandmother who stayed with them off and on, a narrow living room, secondhand furniture, a television that gave off a dull electric warmth long after it had been switched off. Neighbors later said they kept to themselves. Nothing about them invited attention. That, in some quiet way, made the case worse. The first events that unsettled them could still be explained. A package moved from the front mat to the windowsill, a kitchen cabinet left open, the grandmother insisting she had heard someone speak in the hall outside at 3 o'clock in the morning, though no footsteps followed. Then came the phone calls. Sometimes the man called late in the evening, sometimes near dawn. Once, according to one account, the phone rang just after the child woke, crying from a dream, and the caller asked whether the nightmare had been about the red water again. No one in the apartment had spoken about that dream outside the home. After that, fear settled in by degrees. It did not arrive all at once. It thickened the air instead. The couple checked locks twice, then 3 times. They closed the blinds before sunset. They lowered their voices without quite knowing why. The grandmother began covering the peephole with a folded square of tissue, saying she did not like the feeling of an eye meeting hers through it. In daylight, the apartment remained ordinary. Laundry piled in corners, sunlight crossed the floor in long, pale bars. The refrigerator hummed, the child watched cartoons, someone boiled water for tea. But each evening, as the building darkened and the corridor outside flattened into shadow, the rooms seemed to draw inward. Then the caller mentioned the woman from downstairs. He asked whether she had stopped by yet to complain about the leak. At that point, no one from downstairs had come up, there had been no complaint, the ceiling below was still dry. The family listened to the message twice, then a third time, standing in the kitchen with the overhead light buzzing faintly above them. The grandmother turned toward the ceiling as if she could hear water gathering inside it. The next afternoon, the downstairs tenant knocked on the door with a hard, irritated look and said there was a stain spreading above her bathroom mirror. The police were contacted not long after that, though exactly when depends on whose version is being told. Some say officers came after the voicemail about the leak. Some say the family waited until the caller described the child's school backpack, including the fading cartoon patch stitched near the zipper. Either way, the first formal response appears to have been cautious. Harassing calls, possible stalking, nothing yet that could be pinned to a face. The officers asked practical questions in calm voices. Had anyone recently been in the apartment for repairs? Had there been arguments with neighbors? Had the family given out personal information? They took notes beside the front window while afternoon traffic drifted outside in a long metallic hush. Then they left, promising follow-up. That night, another message appeared. The same voice said the officers had forgotten a pen on the radiator cover, and he was right. He also said one of them would come back alone because he had left part of his report unfinished. According to the family, the apartment seemed to go still around those words. The refrigerator stopped humming. The pipes made a sound like a throat being cleared deep inside the wall. The child, who had been playing on the floor, looked up without speaking. Less than an hour later, there was a knock at the door, and one of the officers stood outside, apologetic, asking if he had left his pen. Stories like this often grow around their own emptiness. Where facts end, rumor begins laying down its thin, cold layers. Some later believed the caller must have been watching from inside the building. Others suspected an employee, a former tenant, someone who knew how sound moved through the place and where vents carried conversation. There were quieter theories too. A maintenance worker with keys, a neighbor nobody noticed, someone who had become obsessed not with harming the family at first, but with proving that privacy in a city could be peeled away one detail at a time. Yet the part that remained hardest to explain was not how he knew the present, it was how he seemed to know what came next. He spoke of small things first, the kind of things that could be called lucky guesses if taken one by one. He said the grandmother would cut her thumb on a can lid. She did. He mentioned that the child would lose a tooth at school and come home frightened by the blood. That happened too. He said a framed picture near the television would fall during the night, and before morning, the glass would be broken across the rug in glittering pieces. The family moved the frame into a drawer after hearing that message, but another picture, one no one had thought about, slipped from a shelf after midnight and shattered in the dark. With each correct detail, the apartment changed. It became less like shelter and more like a place already known to someone else. They stopped discussing plans inside it. They took walks just to talk privately, though even then they lowered their voices when passing parked cars. The child began sleeping in the living room with the television on low, not watching it, only needing the murmur of people who were not there. The grandmother insisted that whoever was doing this had been inside before because some knowledge could not be gathered from windows or walls alone. She said there was a difference between being watched and being remembered. Investigators, according to later accounts, tried tracing the calls. Some were routed through services that obscured origin, others ended too quickly. One call appeared to come from a public phone that no longer existed by the time officers checked. Another was linked to a convenience store where no clerk remembered the man who used it. These details, repeated over the years, gave the case its urban legend shape. Los Angeles is full of places where one person can vanish into the machinery of the city. Light, traffic, distance, apartment blocks stacked close as filing cabinets, every face passing a bus stop can look temporary. The family prepared to leave. That much seems consistent across versions. Boxes appeared in the apartment, clothes were folded and refolded, important papers disappeared into a single taped envelope. They told almost no one. The plan, if it can be called that, was to go quietly and break whatever chain had bound this man to them. The grandmother wrapped dishes in newspaper at the dining table while dusk pooled in the corners of the room. The child asked whether the new place would have the same pipes. No one answered. On the final night in the apartment, the voicemail arrived before sunset. It was shorter than the others. The man said there was no point packing the blue suitcase first because the zipper would fail again. He said they should keep the medicine in reach because the grandmother would feel faint on the stairs. Then, after a pause, he said something that was remembered differently by different people, but all versions share the same shape. He referred to a knock at the door that would come later and warned them not to open it until the third knock. There had never been a pattern of 3 knocks. Darkness gathered slowly outside the windows. The building seemed unusually quiet, as if other residents had stepped out of it all at once. The grandmother sat with one hand over the packed envelope of documents. The couple checked the locks. The child slept early on a folded blanket, face turned toward the television glow. Now and then, a car passed below and cast moving bands of light across the ceiling. The blue suitcase, left open near the bedroom door, had indeed snagged at the zipper. Nobody said that aloud. At some point after midnight, someone knocked. Once, the sound was soft, almost polite. Every person in the apartment heard it. The grandmother looked toward the door without moving. The second knock came after a long pause, louder this time, enough to wake the child. The mother held him close. The father stood in the narrow hallway between living room and door, not approaching, just listening. Outside, there were no footsteps, no voice, no rattle of keys. Only the old building holding its breath around them. The third knock never came. Instead, the phone rang. Not the mobile phone, the apartment phone. the old one near the kitchen wall that had carried most of the calls. Its ring cut through the silence with a flat mechanical force that made the child cry out. No one moved to answer it at first. It rang and rang, each burst seeming louder than the last, until finally the father crossed the room and lifted the receiver with a hand that later would not stop shaking. At first, there was only breathing. Then the familiar voice said, very gently, that he had told them not to open the door until the third knock, and that now it was too late anyway because the person outside had gone. The father asked who it was. The caller did not answer. Instead, he asked whether the officer had come back yet. There was no officer expected that night. According to the most repeated version, there came then a new sound from the corridor, distant but distinct, as if someone at the far end had begun walking toward the apartment with measured steps, not hurried, not hesitant, just steady, unbroken movement over old hallway flooring. The father stood frozen with the receiver to his ear. The breathing on the line matched nothing and explained nothing. The grandmother began whispering under her breath in a language the child did not understand. The footsteps came closer, then stopped directly outside the door. This time there was no knock. Something brushed the metal of the knob once, lightly, like fingertips testing temperature. Then silence. The caller remained on the line for several more seconds. When he finally spoke again, his voice had changed in a way no one later described the same way. Some said it sounded pleased, some said it sounded disappointed. One account says it sounded farther away, almost hollow, as though he had stepped into a larger room. He said only that they should leave before morning, because after morning it would become difficult to tell who had been inside. The line went dead. They left before dawn. That part is treated as fact. Bags, child, documents, blue suitcase with the bad zipper. They went down the stairwell because no one trusted the elevator. On the landing between floors, the grandmother did become faint. The envelope of papers slipped from her lap and scattered. One sheet drifted against the railing and hung there for a moment before dropping into the dim shaft below. The father later said he had the strange certainty, while gathering them, that someone on the floor beneath was standing perfectly still and looking up through the central opening of the stairs. When he forced himself to look, he saw only darkness and the pale rectangle of a lower hallway. After they left, the case thinned. New address, changed numbers, fewer public details. Publicly discussed incidents like this do not always end with arrests or explanations. Sometimes they end with distance, with silence, with a family deciding that survival is enough and clarity is not owed to anyone. There were said to be no further calls for a while. Then there were rumors of one more, months later, to a phone number almost no one had. In that final message, the caller reportedly asked whether the child still remembered the hallway with no third knock. That part has never been confirmed. What remained in local retellings was the apartment itself. Tenants came and went, managers changed, paint went over old scuffs, carpets were replaced. Still, people in the building are said to have talked about the family who moved out before sunrise and never returned for the rest of their things. A neighbor claimed a box of kitchenware stayed in the manager's office for weeks. Another said the unit was empty longer than it should have been and that maintenance workers disliked entering after dark. Someone else insisted the old phone jack in the kitchen was removed because it kept picking up dead air. The most unsettling detail survives in the smallest form. According to one version of the story, investigators reviewing notes from the early calls found that the man had mentioned a minor event no one recognized at the time. He said that before everything ended, one of them would look back from the stairwell and think they saw a person standing inside the apartment they had just locked, not at the door, farther in, near the living room window where the evening light used to fall. Only later did the father remember that moment. He had looked back once while carrying the blue suitcase. He had seen, through the narrow opening before the door latched, what seemed to be a figure already inside the room, motionless and waiting in the dimness. He convinced himself it had been a coat hanging from a chair. That is what he told himself then, that is what he told police later. But years afterward, when the story had become a half-whispered Los Angeles cautionary tale and the details had begun to blur at the edges, the one thing he reportedly remained certain about was this: the figure had not been near the chair. Next story. The Friendly Stranger on the Trail. The Appalachian Trail stretches for over 2,000 miles, a continuous ribbon of dirt woven through the oldest mountains in North America. Hikers call it the Green Tunnel. In the spring, the canopy grows thick, choking out the sunlight and wrapping travelers in a perpetual damp twilight. There is a deep, primal silence there, broken only by the crunch of boots on leaves and the distant calls of unseen birds. It is a place where people go to find peace, to leave the noise of civilization behind. But that same isolation demands a heavy toll. Out in the deep woods, miles from the nearest paved road, you are completely cut off from the world. There are no police, there are no sirens. If you scream, the sound is swallowed by a million ancient trees. In this quiet void, a specific culture has evolved, one built entirely on implicit trust. Hikers rely on each other. They share food, they share shelter, and they trust the strangers they meet at the end of a long day of walking. It is a beautiful system, fragile as glass. And when that glass violently shatters, it leaves a jagged, bleeding wound that the forest never forgets. In May of 1981, the trail through Virginia was blooming with new life. Robert Mountford and Laura Ramsey were 27 years old, far from their home in Maine. They were social workers, people who dedicated their lives to helping troubled youth and the marginalized. Their hearts were open, their demeanors naturally kind and empathetic. Taking time away from the heavy emotional toll of their professions, they had set out to hike the Appalachian Trail. By the time they reached Giles County, Virginia, they had already walked for weeks. They were hardened to the physical demands of the trail, their legs strong, their heavy packs settled perfectly against their shoulders. They had fallen into the hypnotic, repetitive rhythm of the long-distance hiker: wake at dawn, walk through the morning mist, rest in the afternoon heat, and find a wooden shelter before sunset. They knew the unwritten rules of the woods, they knew how to read a topographic map, how to filter stream water, and how to spot a friendly face. The culture of the trail dictates that fellow hikers and locals who frequent the path are kindred spirits. There is a common term, trail magic, used to describe the unexpected acts of kindness bestowed upon weary travelers. A cold drink left by a trailhead, a lift into a resupply town, or a local offering a warm fire and conversation at a shelter. When Robert and Laura approached the Wapiti shelter in the Jefferson National Forest, the sun was beginning its slow descent behind the ridges. The shadows stretched long and thin across the dirt. It was late afternoon, perhaps around 5 o'clock. Their bodies ached for rest. The shelter was a simple, three-sided wooden structure with a tin roof, a common sight along the trail, designed to offer a dry, elevated place to sleep. But they were not alone. A man was already sitting near the shelter. He looked like any other local who might wander up the mountain for a day of scouting or camping. He was young, in his late 20s, blending seamlessly into the rustic environment with his unkempt hair and rugged clothes. His name was Randall Lee Smith. At first glance, there was nothing remarkable or threatening about him. He greeted Robert and Laura with the familiar, easygoing charm that hikers expect from rural Virginians. He knew the woods intimately. He knew the trails. He offered them the kind of casual, soft-spoken conversation that eases the fatigue of a 20-mile day. Robert and Laura dropped their heavy packs, their muscles sighing in relief. They set out their foam sleeping pads and pulled out their small brass camp stoves to boil water for dinner. The atmosphere was light and welcoming. They shared the small dirt clearing with Smith, treating him with the same open-hearted trust they offered to everyone they met on their journey. They exchanged stories. They talked about the weather, the steep conditions of the path ahead, the quiet beauty of the surrounding forest. Smith listened, nodding, smiling softly at their anecdotes. He played the part of the friendly trail angel to absolute perfection. As the light faded from the sky and the cold, damp air of the mountain evening settled over the camp, the three of them sat near the shelter. The woods grew dark, transitioning into the kind of absolute, suffocating blackness that only exists miles away from electric lights. The only illumination came from the faint glow of the stars through the leaves and the beam of a single flashlight. Then, the atmosphere in the camp began to shift. It was not a sudden explosion of violence, but a slow, agonizing drop in the psychological temperature. The casual conversation naturally ebbed as the night deepened, but the silence that followed was not the comfortable, heavy-lidded quiet of tired travelers. It was taut, it was expectant. Robert and Laura, highly attuned to human behavior through their years of social work, might have felt the first subtle prickle of unease on the back of their necks. The friendly local was no longer making small talk. He was no longer looking at the trees or the dirt. He was just sitting, watching them. The horror of the Wapiti shelter did not begin with a shout or a sudden lunge. It began with the slow, deliberate death of a smile. The amiable, easygoing mask that Randall Lee Smith wore began to slip away, muscle by muscle. The warmth vanished entirely from his eyes, leaving behind a stare as cold, flat, and empty as a frozen lake. He was looking at Robert and Laura not as fellow human beings, not as interesting travelers from out of state, but as objects. The physical transformation in his posture was complete, and it was utterly terrifying. The realization of what was happening would have washed over the young couple like freezing water. They were not sharing a camp with a trail angel. They were trapped in a cage of trees with a predator. The silence of the deep woods suddenly turned deeply hostile. The chirping of the night insects sounded like a mocking chorus. The closest paved road was miles away over rough terrain. The nearest town was nothing but a distant rumor. There was no cell phone service in 1981, no handheld radios, no panic button to press. Every survival instinct they possessed was screaming that the man sitting just feet away from them was a lethal threat, but there was nowhere to run. The Appalachian Trail is treacherous at night, a twisting, narrow path of slippery roots and jagged rocks that would easily break an ankle in the pitch black. They were pinned down in the open front of the three-sided shelter, utterly exposed to the dark and to the man sitting in it. When Smith finally produced a weapon, the illusion of safety was permanently and violently shattered. The friendly stranger who had shared their evening, who had listened to their stories of Maine, who had smiled at their jokes, was now holding their lives in his hands. It is the ultimate paralyzing nightmare of the wilderness, the profound, unfathomable betrayal of trust. To look into the face of someone you just shared bread with, only to find a hollow, emotionless void looking back at you. He had played a game with them. He had sat patiently, waiting for the sun to disappear, waiting for them to take off their heavy boots, waiting for them to become completely physically and mentally vulnerable. The extreme isolation of the forest, once a source of deep spiritual comfort for the hikers, became an inescapable, suffocating trap. The ancient trees stood as silent, indifferent witnesses to the slow, methodical cruelty that was about to unfold. Robert Mountford and Laura Ramsey never walked out of the Jefferson National Forest. Their journey of self-discovery ended brutally in the dirt and wet leaves of Giles County. Robert was shot point blank. Laura fought desperately for her life, a frantic struggle in the dark woods, but was ultimately bludgeoned and stabbed to death. Smith dragged their bodies into the brush and buried them in shallow graves near the shelter, leaving their grieving families and the entire hiking community in a state of sheer devastation. When their remains were finally discovered days later, the inherent innocence of the Appalachian Trail was fractured beyond repair. The murders sent a permanent shockwave of paranoia through the tight-knit community of long-distance backpackers. The sacred, unwritten law of implicit trust had been violently violated. Decades later, the ghost of that betrayal still haunts the Long Green Tunnel. The original Wapiti shelter was eventually dismantled, torn down piece by piece to erase the physical reminder of the nightmare, but the mountain soil there retains the heavy memory. Every hiker who walks through the dense, darkening woods of Virginia must eventually grapple with a chilling knowledge. The greatest danger in the wild is not the black bears, nor the freezing weather, nor the treacherous rocky terrain. The true horror is the realization that a warm smile can be a hunting tactic, and that miles from the safety of civilization, the friendly stranger on the trail might just be waiting for the sun to go down. The last time anyone heard from Emily Carter. The phone was not supposed to be moving anymore. By the fourth night after Emily Carter disappeared, the search teams had already walked the creek beds, the drainage ditches, the gravel roads that lifted out into the dark fields north of town. Deputies had checked the usual places first, then the less usual ones. They had spoken to the man at the gas station, the woman who claimed she saw Emily near the highway shoulder, the couple who said they heard a car door slam sometime after midnight. The public updates grew thinner with each passing day. The first photographs began to fade from storefront windows. But just after midnight, according to reports later discussed by people close to the case, Emily's phone connected to a nearby tower again. Not far away, not out in another state, not gone. Just there, somewhere in the dark, as if it had only just been switched on by a patient hand. Northern Colorado has long stretches where sound travels too clearly at night. A dog barking 3 properties over can seem close enough to touch. Wind moving through dry grass can sound like whispering in a room that should be empty. The roads outside the smaller towns run between irrigation ditches, storage sheds, old fencing, and fields that flatten under moonlight until distance becomes difficult to judge. It was in a place like that, people said, where Emily had last been seen. Not in a dramatic way, not running, not screaming, just present, and then no longer present. What could be confirmed publicly was sparse. Emily had gone missing after an ordinary evening by every outward measure. There was no sign of a struggle that authorities chose to describe in detail. Her vehicle, according to discussion that followed, was not found abandoned on some lonely road in the way people first imagined. The confusion started almost immediately. One witness said she left alone. Another said she had been arguing with someone in a parking lot lit by weak amber bulbs. A third insisted she looked calm, distracted if anything, as though listening for something outside the frame of conversation. None of it aligned cleanly. The accounts overlapped in shape and not in substance, the way stories do when people want badly to be useful and fear what their own memory might have missed. By the second day, volunteers were driving slow loops through the county roads with their windows cracked, calling her name into culverts and shelter belts and the mouths of abandoned farm buildings. Flyers went up in laundromats, diners, and feed stores. The usual machinery of concern began to turn. Family members made statements. Friends repeated the same careful phrases into local microphones. She would not have vanished on purpose. She was not the sort of person to disappear. She would have called, she would have answered. It was the kind of language people use when trying to build a wall against the dark, as if the right sequence of facts could keep something unreal from becoming permanent. Then came the first mention of the phone. Not an answered call, not a message, only a connection. A small thing, technical and bloodless on paper. Her device had reached a tower sometime late at night, then gone silent again. Searchers shifted their attention toward the area suggested by the signal. Roads were checked, empty lots were checked, water was checked, ditches were checked twice. Nothing. The ground gave back no shoe, no coat, no bag, no clean explanation. And when morning came, the land looked exactly as it had the day before. Wide and ordinary and untroubled by what people were beginning to fear it was hiding. The late-night tower connections might have remained a detail buried inside the case if they had happened only once, but according to people who followed the disappearance closely, it happened again. Then again, each time well after dark. Each time brief enough to feel accidental, deliberate, or both. The phone would appear near the same cluster of towers and then vanish before anyone could reach anything that might be called a scene. To some investigators, if reports are to be believed, it suggested movement within a limited area. To others, it suggested a device powered on intermittently by someone who knew just enough to create uncertainty. But uncertainty, once it settles into a town, does not stay professional for long. It seeps under doors, it rides home with the volunteers, it sits in kitchens after the television has gone dark. People began checking their own windows at night. A waitress from a roadside place said she had served Emily coffee earlier that week and remembered her because she kept glancing at the door as if waiting for someone who made her uneasy. A ranch hand swore he saw a light moving near an unused service road close to midnight. low to the ground at first and then higher, as if someone had lifted a phone and turned slowly in a circle. A teenager told deputies he heard a ringtone drifting over the irrigation canal while he was parked with friends, but nobody in the car agreed on what the sound had been. Even within a single memory, things were splitting apart. That was when older stories began to attach themselves to the case the way burrs catch on clothing. There are places in northern Colorado where the newest silence lies over older absences. The old farmhouses with sunken porches, the motels that stand too far from the interstate to be useful now, the barns that look empty from the road until moonlight finds glass where no glass should be. Residents always have stories, though most of them are not told in daylight. A woman gone from a service station near closing time, a hunter who left his truck and did not come back before first snow, lights seen moving through fallow fields long after the nearest house had gone dark. None of it proved anything. None of it needed to. In a place that keeps its distances, rumor becomes a second weather. Emily's case became the center these stories drifted toward. Her friends were said to be exhausted by the contradictions. One of them told a local reporter, in the careful voice of someone trying not to become part of the spectacle, that the worst part was not the not knowing, it was the false almosts. Each late-night signal felt like proof that an answer was nearby. Each morning erased it. Some nights they stayed awake, dressed and ready, waiting to hear that searchers had found her alive in some outbuilding or stranded on some back road. Instead, there would be another clipped update, another request for tips, another statement that the investigation was active and ongoing. The language remained steady even as everyone listening to it began to hear the hollowness underneath. One volunteer, according to local discussion afterward, had driven the area of the strongest signal alone after midnight despite being asked not to. He took a county road lined with bare cottonwoods and followed it until pavement became packed dirt. There were no houses for a while, then one old place set back from the road with no porch light, no visible vehicle, and plywood over one of the windows. He later said he stopped because he thought he saw a pale rectangle moving behind the glass, bright for a second, then gone. When he rolled down his window, he heard nothing at first, except the ticking of his own engine cooling. Then, very faintly, a vibration. Not a ringtone exactly. More like a phone set to silent and left on a hard surface somewhere inside the dark. He did not go in. He told himself he was being foolish. He drove back toward town and reported it the next day, ashamed of how uncertain he sounded even to himself. By then, the phone had connected on another night. Always late, always brief, always enough. Technicians could explain the basics. A device could wake for many reasons. Battery fluctuations, environmental interference, limited handshakes with the network, delayed behavior not always meaningful to a layperson. People repeated these explanations because they needed them. But explanations only work as far as the pattern allows. This pattern did not spread out randomly across daylight hours. It did not drift county to county. It happened at night, in a narrow band of darkness, as if something waited for the town to become still before letting the signal rise. The most disturbing detail never appeared in any official release, but it survived in conversation because it had the shape of something that should not be true. According to those who claim to know, Emily's voicemail changed sometime after the disappearance, not the greeting itself, the space after it. Callers began to say there was a sound underneath the silence, so faint they first mistook it for the hiss of a poor connection. Then, one of Emily's cousins listened to it more than once and said it sounded like wind passing through a narrow opening with a hollow knock at uneven intervals, as though something loose were striking wood somewhere nearby. Another person insisted there was breathing, another said they heard water. Each listener found a different horror inside the same static. That may have been grief, it may have been suggestion, but after that, some family friends stopped calling altogether. The witness statements only grew stranger as they were repeated. The woman who believed she had seen Emily by the highway later said she was no longer sure it had been Emily at all, only someone with the same light jacket and the same habit of holding one arm close to her body when cold. The couple who reported a car door after midnight began arguing over whether the sound had actually been farther away than they first claimed. The man at the gas station changed one detail in a way that unsettled everyone who noticed. At first, he said Emily looked tired. Later, he said she looked as though she had been crying. Then, in a quieter interview that circulated among locals more than it aired publicly, he said she had looked frightened for only a second and that the fear had not been directed at anyone in the store. It had been aimed through the front window toward the darkness outside. No suspect was clearly named in the public imagination because the facts would not stay still long enough to support one. That left room for the older American habit of filling blank spaces with place, with atmosphere, with whatever had frightened the town before this latest absence arrived. People pointed to the isolated structures beyond the main roads. They spoke of storage units, disused farm equipment, sheds, hunting cabins no one checked until deep winter. Some remembered older cases from other states, stories of missing people whose belongings lingered longer in the landscape than their bodies did. Others spoke more softly, and only at home, about the way certain roads seemed to collect trouble. A person could drive them 100 times in daylight and feel nothing. Then, one night, the same road would seem to turn its face and show some other character entirely. Searchers kept going. They searched by morning and by dusk. They searched on foot and in vehicles. They searched places no one wanted to search. The weather shifted in small Colorado ways, cold enough before dawn to sting the lungs, then thin sunlight over the fields, then evening coming on too quickly. Boots pressed new patterns into mud that dried and cracked by the next day. Tape fluttered where officers had marked off areas and then, once cleared, removed themselves from them. In photographs taken from the roadside, the landscape looked open. Standing inside it was different. Inside it, every ditch had depth. Every cluster of trees held shadow long after the rest of the ground had gone pale. A deputy was said to have remarked, off the record and long after, that the worst searches were the ones conducted in nearly complete silence. Not because silence was eerie in itself, but because it changed the rhythm of expectation. A person walking through brush begins to hear every small disturbance as meaningful. A scrape becomes a footstep. A bird lifting out of weeds becomes movement. The mind begins to prepare for discovery over and over, and each time it finds only more land. Emily's search, by those accounts, had that feeling. Not dramatic, not cinematic. Only prolonged, cold disappointment broken at intervals by the tiny cruelty of electronic hope. Then a rancher reported seeing a light. He was closing a gate not far from one of the tower areas when he noticed a glow in the distance, low and blue-white, blinking between stands of scrub. He assumed at first it was another volunteer, though by then official searches had been scaled back at night. The light vanished, reappeared farther along, vanished again. He called out once, no answer. By the time he reached the fence line nearest the glow, it was gone. He later said what unsettled him most was not the distance or the darkness, but the height of it. Too low for someone walking with a flashlight. About right, he thought afterward, for a phone being carried loosely at thigh level. After that report, people began keeping track of the time. Just after midnight. A little before 1 a.m., closer to 2 on one occasion, depending on which account was believed. The pattern narrowed into ritual. It was as if Emily's disappearance had not ended in a single moment, but was still occurring in fragments every night. A signal, a light, a sound, then nothing by dawn. Emily's mother, according to people close to the family, stopped sleeping in her bedroom and moved to the living room sofa because it was nearer the front window. She did not say she expected Emily to come walking up the driveway. She was too practical for language like that. But practical people also leave lamps on for reasons they do not discuss. She kept her phone on the coffee table with the sound turned high. She answered every unknown number. Sometimes she would wake certain she had heard the vibration of a call and find the screen dark, the room washed in that thin pre-dawn color that makes furniture look abandoned. Once, very late, she reportedly received a burst of silence long enough to make her say Emily's name twice into the line before the connection dropped. Whether it was a real event, a wrong number, or a story changed by repetition is impossible to say. In missing person cases, grief does not merely remember, it edits. The house Emily had left behind became another quiet center of the case. Friends came and went at first, gathering clothes, feeding pets if there were pets, checking drawers for anything that might help. Later, the visits slowed. The rooms settled. A cup remained where it had been set down. A charger stayed plugged into the wall with nothing attached to it. Shoes waited by a door that no longer opened for the person who had worn them. It is often the ordinary objects that make a disappearance feel least survivable. Not blood, not drama. Just a brush with hair still caught in it. A receipt folded into a coat pocket. The pale square on a nightstand where a phone used to charge before someone took it into the dark. Weeks passed, if later retellings are accurate, without the case becoming clearer. Public interest rose and fell. The flyers weathered. Tape marks on certain windows faded. New events in other places pulled attention away, but local memory held on to the tower connections because they resisted the comfort of finality. If Emily's phone had gone dead at once, people could have folded that fact into the bleak arithmetic of disappearance. Instead, it kept returning like a hand on the shoulder after everyone in the room had gone still. There was one more detail. Not official, not proved, but repeated often enough that it survives wherever the case is mentioned in low voices. A utility worker doing routine checks near one of the tower zones found an old outbuilding on private land with fresh scuff marks near the threshold. Nothing dramatic, no obvious sign of forced entry. Just the feeling that the door had been opened recently despite the dust and weather on the rest of the structure. He did not go in at first because the smell coming through the gap was stale and mineral, damp wood, and cold earth. When he returned later with the property owner, the inside held only old equipment, broken shelving, and a workbench. On the bench lay a phone charger with no phone attached to it. The model was common. It proved nothing. But the owner swore it had not been there the season before. No public account ever confirmed that the charger belonged to Emily. No public statement ever tied the tower signals to a specific place. That is where truth begins to fray into the darker fabric people make to cover what they cannot bear to leave exposed. Some say investigators knew more than they released and withheld it for reasons of procedure. Some say the signals were meaningless and the town built a ghost from network noise because grief prefers a moving target to a permanent grave. Others, more quietly, say the phone was being powered on by someone who liked the idea of nearness, someone who wanted the search to circle without landing, someone who understood how much terror could be created by a device no larger than a hand. What remains, years later, in the way such stories are told, is not a solved ending, but a schedule of dread. Midnight settling over the county roads, empty fields silvered by moonlight, barns and sheds standing dark against the horizon, a family home with one lamp burning, search volunteers who once thought technology would bring certainty, now staring at maps that only tightened the mystery. And somewhere in that wide northern dark, according to reports and rumors that never fully died, a phone waking just long enough to remind everyone that Emily Carter had not simply vanished. Something or someone had lingered after her. Even now, locals sometimes mention that the roads around those tower zones feel wrong after midnight, not haunted in the theatrical sense, just watched, as if the land there learned the habit of waiting. Drivers passing through say they lower the radio without meaning to. They check the passenger seat for a light that is not there, they notice how often they look toward the fields, and if their own phones lose service for a moment or vibrate once without explanation, they think of the case whether they want to or not. Because the last time anyone was certain they heard from Emily Carter was not a voice, not a cry for help, not a message that could be saved and replayed. It was only a brief, cold acknowledgement from the dark. A signal touching a tower in the middle of the night, then slipping away before anyone could reach it. The kind of thing that would have meant almost nothing in another case. In this one, it was enough to keep the town listening long after the sound was gone. The beast of Bray Road's gaze. There is a specific kind of silence that settles over the rural farmlands of Walworth County, Wisconsin, when the autumn harvest is done. It is not a peaceful quiet. It is a heavy, expectant stillness, broken only by the dry rustle of dead corn stalks swaying in the night wind. Out here, beyond the reach of city streetlights, the darkness is absolute. The only geometry is the straight, paved line of county highways cutting through the endless fields. For decades, the locals of Elkhorn have understood that when the fog rolls in off the fields, something else claims the night. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, a subtle but undeniable shift occurred in the atmosphere of this quiet dairy community. It began as hushed conversations in the back booths of local diners, a farmer reporting an unnervingly large canine tearing into a chicken wire fence, a teenager claiming a monster chased her car down a dark stretch of gravel. At first, it was easy to dismiss these accounts as the products of overactive imaginations or too much cheap beer, but then the witnesses began to change. Reasonable, grounded individuals started coming forward. A local journalist began compiling these scattered reports, realizing they all shared chillingly specific details. Even off-duty police officers and seasoned hunters admitted to seeing something out on the lonely stretches of asphalt that defied natural explanation. They called it the Beast of Bray Road. The descriptions were terrifyingly consistent. It was not a wolf, nor was it a bear. Witnesses spoke of a creature with dark, matted fur, a broad chest, and a snout resembling a canine, yet it possessed an anatomy that allowed it to kneel, grasp, and move with a sickeningly human grace. The local lore did not paint a picture of a phantom or a ghost. It painted a picture of flesh, bone, and muscle. It was an apex predator, existing quietly in the peripheral vision of the modern world, only stepping into the light when it chose to. The true horror of Bray Road does not rely on folklore. It relies on the primal vulnerability of being utterly alone in the dark. It is a vulnerability understood entirely by those who find themselves navigating the dense, freezing fog that blankets the Wisconsin flatlands deep in the early hours of the morning. It is nearing 2:15 a.m. The air outside is cold enough to leave a thin layer of frost on the skeletal branches of the oak trees lining the roadside. A solitary car moves along the blacktop, its tires hissing against the damp asphalt. Inside, a woman grips the steering wheel, her eyes straining against the thick gray soup that reduces her visibility to a mere 20 yards. The high beams of her headlights are practically useless, reflecting off the water droplets in the air and creating a blinding white wall. She drops to her low beams, her speed decelerating to a cautious crawl. There is no radio signal out here, only the low, steady hum of the engine and the rhythmic squeak of the windshield wipers cutting through the mist. The isolation is total. If the engine were to stall, the nearest farmhouse is miles away, its occupants long since asleep. In this enclosed space, surrounded by the vast, unseen wilderness, the car feels less like a sanctuary and more like a fragile metal cage. Up ahead, on the right shoulder of the road, a shadow bleeds through the fog. At first, it is just an indistinct mass, darker than the surrounding night. The driver taps her brakes, anticipating a stray deer or perhaps a neighbor's loose cow. As the car inches closer, the headlights begin to carve out the shape of the obstruction. It is not a cow. It is an enormous, dark figure crouched low to the ground, positioned over the mangled remains of a freshly killed white-tailed deer. The driver brings the vehicle to a complete halt, her foot pressing firmly against the brake pedal. The engine idles loudly in the dead quiet of the night. Through the glass, illuminated by the twin beams of the halogen headlights, the scene unfolds with horrifying clarity. The creature's back is turned to the car. Thick, coarse fur, the color of wet ash and charcoal, covers a torso that is impossibly broad. Heavy muscles ripple beneath its coat as it tears into the carcass. The sound is muffled by the closed windows, but the violent, jerky movements of the creature's head leave no doubt as to what it is doing. Large, clawed hands, bearing a sickening resemblance to human fingers, grip the deer's ribcage to hold it steady. A rational mind desperately searches for a comforting explanation. It must be a grizzly bear that wandered hundreds of miles out of its territory, or an abnormally large mutated wolf. But the proportions are entirely wrong. The shoulders are tapered like a weightlifter's, the arms too long and heavily articulated. A cold, heavy knot of dread tightens in the driver's stomach. Her breath hitches, clouding the cold glass of her side window. She knows she should press the accelerator and speed past, but her body is paralyzed by a deeply ingrained ancestral terror. She is a witness to something that should not exist. Then, the creature registers the presence of the car. It stops feeding. The sudden stillness is worse than the violent movement. The beast drops a torn piece of flesh onto the damp asphalt. Slowly, with a deliberate and terrifying grace, it begins to rise. It does not stay on all fours like a startled animal preparing to flee. Instead, it pushes off the ground, its powerful hind legs straightening. The joints pop and crack with sickening volume, audible even over the idling engine. The creature unfolds itself, rising up and up, towering over the hood of the car. It stands firmly on two legs, reaching a height of well over 7 feet. Its sheer mass blocks out the white line painted on the edge of the road. The beast turns its head to face the vehicle. The headlights illuminate a terrifying visage. A long, dark snout, drawn back in a subtle sneer, reveals teeth stained crimson with fresh blood. Pointed ears sit high on a lupine skull, but the true nightmare lies in its eyes. They are a luminescent, pale amber, catching the artificial light and reflecting it back into the fog. The horror of the moment does not stem from a roar or a feral lunge toward the glass. The monster does not act like a cornered beast running on blind instinct. Instead, it simply stares. It stares through the windshield, past the glare of the headlights, looking directly into the terrified eyes of the woman behind the wheel. The gaze is calculating. It is an expression of deep, predatory intelligence. The creature recognizes the metal machine for what it is, and more importantly, it recognizes the soft, fragile human trapped inside it. There is a silent communication in that unblinking stare, an understanding of absolute dominance. It is deciding, in real time, whether to let her live. Time loses all meaning in the heavy, suffocating silence. The beast's chest rises and falls with deep, measured breaths. Finally, after what feels like an eternity, the creature dismisses her. It turns its massive shoulders away from the light, takes one long, fluid step over the guardrail, and melts seamlessly into the dense, fog-choked woods. The darkness swallows it whole, leaving only the mutilated remains of the deer on the shoulder as proof that the encounter was not a hallucination. The driver slams her foot onto the gas pedal, the tires screech against the pavement, struggling for traction before launching the car forward into the night. She does not look in the rearview mirror. She drives until the fuel tank is nearly empty, long after the rural roads have given way to the safety of sodium streetlights and civilization. The Elkhorn police logs from those years are filled with similar reports. Stunned drivers stumbling into the station, their faces pale, their hands shaking as they try to describe a nightmare that walked on two legs. Skeptics continue to write off the Bray Road beast as misidentified bears, large dogs, or a mass sociological delusion. But those who have driven down that isolated stretch of blacktop in the dead of night know the truth. They know that when the fog rolls in and the temperature drops, the woods harbor ancient, intelligent predators. And they know that if you find yourself stopped on the edge of a cornfield, caught in the pale glow of amber eyes, your survival is entirely dependent on a monster's mercy. The night the 911 operator hung up first. By the time the operator understood that the caller was answering too late, the line had already gone quiet once, then opened again on its own with a soft scrape, as if the receiver had been lifted by a hand that did not know what a telephone was supposed to sound like. The county dispatch room sat behind the sheriff's office in a low building of painted cinder block with one narrow window facing a gravel lot and the black outline of the hills beyond. At that hour, there was only one operator on duty, a woman who had worked the night shift long enough to know the different silences of the county. There was the silence of winter roads after midnight, when even the logging trucks were gone, There was the silence that came before a domestic call, when breathing filled the line but nobody wanted to speak first. And there was the silence of open land, old houses, and telephone wires stretched across hollows where the dark seemed to collect and stay. The call that came in just after 3 o'clock in the morning did not match any of those. The first part of the recording, according to later reports, was incomplete. The county's equipment was old even then, and pieces of incoming audio were known to drop out or distort. What survived began with the operator identifying the line and asking what the emergency was. For a few seconds, there was nothing but a faint rushing sound. Then, a man's voice, distant and thinned by static, said that he needed help. The operator asked him to repeat himself. There was another delay. Then, in the same voice, a little closer this time, he said that something was outside his house. It would not have been unusual by itself. In that part of West Virginia, people called for bears in the yard, strangers on porches, headlights lingering too long at the end of a drive. The operator asked for the address. What made the call strange was not the fear in the man's voice, but the pattern. Each time she asked a question, there was a pause just a little too long to sound natural, followed by an answer that seemed to come not from someone thinking, but from someone listening first. Not to her, to something else. She asked for the address again. A long hush followed. The tape held a faint clicking, not unlike an extension line being lifted somewhere else in the house. Then the man said, carefully, as if repeating words fed to him, that he was at the old roundhouse beyond the creek crossing near the county line. The operator knew the place only vaguely. Rural callers often gave directions instead of house numbers. She asked for a name. Another pause. This time, the answer came wrong. The voice gave the address again, almost word for word, but slower. The operator corrected him, asked again for his name, and when the reply came, it arrived with the same soft delay as if it had crossed a room before entering the mouth that spoke it. According to people who later heard the recording, that was the moment her tone changed. It did not break, she did not panic, but the steadiness flattened. She began speaking more distinctly, as operators are trained to do with frightened callers, and she asked whether the man was alone in the house. The tape carried a low shuffling sound. A hinge moved somewhere. The caller did not answer at first. Then he whispered that he thought so. Outside the dispatch room, nothing moved. The sheriff's deputies were covering a wide area that night, one on a traffic stop near the highway and another farther south on a welfare check. The operator started one unit toward the caller's area, then kept the man talking as best she could. She asked what he could hear. The caller said there had been knocking at the back door for almost an hour. Not loud, not trying to get in, only patient. 3 taps. Then nothing, then 3 taps again. He said his dogs had gone under the kitchen table and would not come out. The operator asked whether he could lock himself in a room. The delay came again. Then the man said, in the same careful tone, that he had already done that. It should have reassured her. It did the opposite. The room sound on the call did not match a closed bedroom or a bathroom. Even through the poor quality of the tape, there was an openness to it, the soft hollow of a larger space. She asked which room he was in. There was no answer. Then, faintly, another voice could be heard. People disagree about that part. Some later said it was only feedback or the warble of bad equipment. Others believed there were 2 people on the line, one farther from the receiver. The surviving audio is not clear enough to prove either version. But several who reviewed the report said the operator reacted as though she heard something she could not place because she stopped speaking for a moment, then asked very quietly whether anyone else was in the room with him. Nothing. Static. A single, dull tap. Then the man answered no. A deputy reached the road nearest the property several minutes later and radioed that the house sat back from the lane at the end of a washed-out drive with no outside lights on. The operator relayed this to the caller, telling him help was almost there. For the first time, the voice on the line seemed to respond without the strange delay. It said thank you immediately with such abrupt relief that she must have felt some easing in her chest. Then, after a pause, the voice added that something had just moved in the hallway. What followed is one of the details repeated most often in retellings of the incident. The operator told the caller not to leave the room, not to make any noise, and to stay on the line. The tape captured a slow creaking sound that might have been floorboards or the receiver shifting in a hand gone damp with sweat. Then there came a series of very soft knocks. Not from the back door, not distant, close. So close that the sound seemed to come through the telephone itself. 3 taps. A pause. 3 taps again. The operator spoke the caller's name, or what she believed was his name from an earlier garbled exchange. There was no answer. Instead, she heard breathing, but it no longer sounded frightened. It sounded measured, curious, the kind of breath someone takes while listening through a wall. The deputy outside radioed that he was approaching the porch. The operator told the caller deputies were entering the property. The line stayed open. In the recording, a new noise emerged then, one that investigators later described only as movement near the mouthpiece. Cloth brushing plastic, a fingernail or ring striking the handset once. Then the man's voice returned, but farther away than before. So far away, it seemed to come from the end of a hall. It said, with that same odd care, do not let them knock. The operator asked what he meant. The voice did not answer. The deputy, now at the door, reported no lights, no response, and no sign of forced entry. The operator told him the caller might be hiding inside. She stayed on the line and asked the man if he could hear the deputy outside. This time, the delay was longer than any before, long enough that she repeated the question. Then the voice said yes. But the deputy radioed at that same moment that he had not knocked yet. After that, the surviving record becomes more confused. One report says the operator asked the caller whether he could see whoever was outside his room. Another says she asked whether there was a second phone in the house. Either way, what matters is that the answer came back before she had finished speaking, not after. It arrived on top of her words in a low murmur, as though whatever was listening had finally learned the timing. Witnesses later claimed that the operator pulled the headset slightly away from one ear at that moment. She would not discuss it in detail afterward. All she ever admitted was that she became certain, for reasons she could not cleanly explain, that the man who had placed the call was no longer the one speaking to her. Whether that belief came from the pacing of the responses, the change in breathing, or the simple animal feeling that something had shifted on the line, nobody could say. The deputy entered through an unlocked back door. He swept the kitchen first. 2 dogs were found under the table, pressed so far back against the wall that he had to crouch to see their eyes. A chair had been overturned near the sink. The phone on the kitchen wall hung in its cradle. The cord was still untouched. There was no one in the room, no obvious sign that a call had been made from there. The operator heard him moving from room to room over the radio, while the line in her headset remained open, full of soft breathing and the faintest scrape, as if the caller were dragging one finger across wallpaper. The deputy checked a sitting room, then a narrow hallway, then the front room facing the road. No one. He reported a damp footprint on the hall floor, but only one, too smeared to judge clearly and odd in shape. Before the operator could ask more, the voice on her line spoke again. It asked whether the deputy was alone. She did not answer. Later, according to coworkers, she said the question felt less like fear and more like appetite. The training manuals on her desk, the illuminated buttons, the buzzing fluorescent light overhead, all the ordinary objects around her began to seem very far away. She pressed her hand against the edge of the console to steady herself and told the deputy to exit the house immediately. He demanded a reason. She did not give one. She only repeated the order, sharper this time. By then, the second deputy had arrived outside. The first deputy began backing toward the kitchen. As he moved, he radioed that one bedroom door at the end of the hall was shut. He said he had not opened it yet because he thought he heard movement inside. The operator closed her eyes for one brief second. When she spoke again, she told him not to open it. The deputy asked why. She said she had the caller on the line, and the caller was not in that room. Nobody ever produced a perfectly satisfying explanation for what happened next. The first deputy ignored her and opened the bedroom door. Inside, according to official notes, the room was empty except for a bed, a lamp, and a small table with a second telephone lying on its side. The line to that phone had been cut, not recently, but sometime before. The copper darkened, the outer sheath dry with dust. On the bedspread, close to the pillow, was an impression deep enough to suggest weight had rested there for a long while. The window above the bed stood open to the black yard behind the house. And from the dispatcher's headset, all at once, there came the sound of knocking again. Not 3 taps this time. 1. Then another, heavier, resonant, and close, like a fist striking wood from the inside. The operator tore the headset off. That was the part people remembered, because operators did not do that. They were trained to stay with a caller through almost anything. But she let the headset fall against the console, and the room microphone picked up enough of the open line for others nearby to hear a voice continuing to speak from the earpiece. Not loudly, not clearly. Just enough to make the hair rise along the necks of the people who later described it. No suspect was found on the property, no caller was identified with certainty. The house belonged, according to county records, to an elderly man who had died some months earlier, though neighbors reportedly claimed a relative came and went from time to time. Some said they had seen a light in the place within the last week. Others insisted it had been empty much longer than that. The available reports do not settle the question. The audio itself remained incomplete, with segments missing at the beginning and end, and some portions badly degraded. What did enter local memory, and stay there, was not the paperwork, but the pattern. The operator had received a call from a house where no working phone appeared to have placed it. She had spoken to a man whose identity could not be pinned down. She had realized, before the deputies did, that the voice answering her questions was changing. And at the moment when trained instinct should have kept her calm and connected, she had done the one thing dispatchers were not supposed to do. She hung up first. Afterwards, she worked only day shifts for a while. Then, not long after, she left the county job entirely. People who knew her said she never liked to discuss the case, though one former coworker remembered her saying that what frightened her was not the possibility of a prank or even a person hiding in the house. It was the delay. The voice always seemed to wait, she said, as though someone else in the room had to hear the question before the answer could be given. In the hills, stories rarely stay fixed. They gather weather and rumor. By the time the tale had traveled through diners, porches, gas stations, and late kitchen conversations, it had changed shape the way all local legends do. Some said the caller had been dead before the phone ever rang. Some said there had been a prowler moving through abandoned houses, lifting receivers, and listening to people breathe. Some said the open bedroom window faced a patch of ground where no grass had grown right for years. And some claimed that on damp nights, if the lines were bad and the county was quiet, dispatchers still heard an extra click before certain calls connected, like someone in another room picking up an extension and saying nothing. None of that was ever proved. But in rural counties, proof does not always kill a story. Sometimes the uncertainty feeds it. A deputy who later retired told the story only once in public, at a civic supper, and even then he avoided the worst parts. He said the thing he remembered most was not the bedroom, or the cut phone line, or the dogs under the table. It was stepping back onto the porch after searching the house and seeing the operator's patrol lights spill across the yard while all the woods beyond remained perfectly still. No wind, no insects. No movement in the trees, just that stillness, deep and watchful, as if the hillside itself had been listening to the call. Years later, people still argued over the details. They argued about the missing seconds on the tape, about whether there had truly been a second voice, about whether the house was occupied, about whether the operator's instincts had saved a deputy from walking deeper into something human or something worse. Those arguments never resolved anything. They only kept the story breathing. And the last part, the quietest part, lingered longest. When the supervisor reviewed the damaged recording near dawn, after the deputies had cleared the scene and the sun had not yet reached the valley, there was almost nothing left at the end. Just static, a faint shift of plastic against a desk, and the soft click of the operator disconnecting the line. Then, beneath it, so faint it could easily have been tape noise, there seemed to be one final sound. Not a voice. Not exactly. More like someone very close to the mouthpiece, learning how to whisper after the call was already over. Montana Rangers logged the same signal for several nights. The hiss of the radio broke at exactly 3:12 a.m., replaced by a wet, heavy sound that did not belong on the emergency frequency. It was not the snap of static, nor was it the sharp tone of an accidental microphone click. It sounded like something large breathing slowly into a receiver, accompanied by the faint, rhythmic crunch of snow under heavy boots. The transmission lasted for 40 seconds before fading back into the white noise of Channel 6. In the isolated watchtower of Station 4, perched high above a vast, frozen expanse of Montana wilderness, the duty ranger simply sat in the dark and listened. The wilderness in late November was a place of absolute isolation. The tourist season had ended months ago, and the deep valleys were already buried under several feet of early winter snow. Only a skeletal crew remained to monitor the high ridges connected to the outside world by a daisy chain of radio repeaters bolted to the freezing peaks. The nearest paved road was 45 miles away. If something went wrong, help was at least a day's journey by snowmobile. The ranger on duty noted the strange transmission in the nightly logbook, marking it down as a phantom signal caused by atmospheric bouncing, a common enough occurrence in the high mountains. But the following night, at exactly 3:12 a.m., the radio cracked open again. The static dropped away instantly, leaving a dead, empty channel. Then the breathing returned. It was louder this time, closer to the microphone, wet and ragged, dragging in the cold air with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Behind the breathing, there was the same steady crunching sound. Something walking through deep snow. The ranger reached for the handset, his thumb hovering over the transmission button, but training held him back. You did not speak into a blind emergency channel unless someone requested aid. He listened as the footsteps seemed to grow louder, as if whoever held the radio was marching steadily toward the microphone itself. By the third night, a deep unease had settled heavily into the watchtower. The ranger had contacted Station 9, located across the valley on the southern ridge, to ask if they had been logging the midnight interference. The operator at Station 9 confirmed the reports. They had heard it too. According to their directional logs, the signal was not bouncing off the upper atmosphere. It was originating from deep within the Blackwood Basin, a densely forested ravine that had been completely inaccessible since the first major blizzard in October. There were no hiking trails down there, no logging roads, and certainly no power sources for a radio transmitter. Yet, the signal was strong, cutting through the high ridge winds with absolute clarity. The Rangers decided to triangulate the broadcast if it happened again. At 3:10 a.m., both men sat by their respective consoles, the green glow of the dials illuminating their small, frost-covered windows. At precisely 3:12 a.m., the squelch broke. The ragged, wet breathing filled both cabins simultaneously. But this time, the footsteps stopped. The deep, agonizing breaths continued for 10 seconds, and then a voice spoke. It was not a human voice. It sounded like a tape recorder playing backwards, a strange, metallic distortion that tried to mimic the cadence of human speech without forming actual words. It was a chaotic string of vowels strung together in a hollow, mocking tone. The ranger at Station 4 keyed his microphone. He broke protocol, stating that this was an official channel and instructing the broadcaster to identify themselves. The strange voice stopped immediately. The breathing returned for a few seconds, followed by the heavy click of the transmission ending. The radio went back to hissing static. Across the valley, the operator at Station 9 came over the internal frequency, his voice tight with tension. He had locked onto the origin point of the signal. It was indeed coming from the bottom of the Blackwood Basin, but there was a glaring problem. The signal had originated from an area where the timber was so thick, even a tracked vehicle could not pass through. The next morning, the ranger at Station 4 began digging through the archival logbooks stored in the metal cabinets beneath the main desk. He was looking for any history of strange radio bounce in the basin, any old repeater stations that might have been abandoned and somehow powered back on. He pulled a dusty binder from 1994 As he turned the brittle pages, his finger stopped on a handwritten entry dated November 12, 1994. The duty officer at the time had logged an unknown transmission at 3:12 a.m. The notes described heavy breathing, the sound of footsteps in snow, and a voice that sounded broken and artificial. According to the old log, the 1994 transmissions had continued for 6 consecutive nights. On the 7th night, the duty ranger had requested a search and rescue flyover of the Blackwood Basin, convinced someone was lost and slowly freezing to death while clutching an open radio. The flyover was conducted the following afternoon. The helicopters found nothing but unbroken snow. No tracks, no camps, no signs of life. But the ranger who had written the log never returned for his next shift. The record stated he had resigned abruptly, leaving his gear in the tower and hiking down the mountain alone. The sun set early that evening, casting long, bruised shadows across the snowfields. The wind picked up, rattling the thick glass of the watchtower windows. The ranger at Station 4 made sure the heavy deadbolt on the reinforced wooden door was thrown entirely shut. He stoked the small wood stove, trying to push the damp cold out of the small room, but a strange chill seemed to radiate from the radio console itself. He sat in the low light, watching the digital clock slowly cycle toward 3 a.m. Across the valley, Station 9 was completely silent. The radio check-in at midnight had been brief, both men too on edge to make small talk. 3:12 a.m. arrived. The radio remained silent. The ranger let out a slow breath, thinking perhaps the atmospheric conditions had finally shifted, burying whatever ghost signal was haunting the valley. Then, at 3:14 a.m., the radio clicked. It did not hiss. It simply opened into dead, silent air. There was no breathing this time. No footsteps crunching in the deep snow. There was only the faint, echoing sound of wind blowing through pine trees, captured by a microphone somewhere out in the dark. Then the voice spoke, but it was not the distorted, chaotic string of vowels from the night before. It was a voice the ranger recognized instantly. It was his own. The radio played back his exact transmission from the previous night, down to the slight hesitation and the static pop of the button. The recording played back into the quiet room. This is an official channel. Identify yourself. The playback sounded hollow, stripped of all warmth, as if it were echoing out of a deep canyon. The ranger stared at the speaker, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had not recorded that transmission. There was no tape deck in the tower. The playback ended, and the open air returned. Then his voice played again. This is an official channel. Identify yourself. Only this time, the words were stretched, the pitch dropping lower and lower until it sounded like a heavy, mechanical groan. The words twisted into a slow, rhythmic distortion that mimicked the wet breathing from the first night. Whatever was down in the valley had not just been making noise, it had been learning. The internal frequency buzzed. It was Station 9. The operator's voice was barely a whisper. He told the ranger at Station 4 to look at the triangulation data. The ranger glanced at the secondary monitor. The blinking green dot, representing the origin of the unknown signal, was no longer resting at the bottom of the Blackwood Basin. It was moving. It was ascending the steep western ridge. It was moving straight up the incline through the dense, impassable timber, heading directly towards Station 4. The ranger watched the screen in silent horror. The dot was moving at an impossible speed. No human could climb a 40-degree incline through waist-deep snow in the dark. A snowmobile would have been loud enough to hear across the valley, and it could not navigate the tightly packed pines. Yet the signal marched steadily upward, covering hundreds of feet every minute. The open radio channel continued to broadcast the sound of the wind, but now the heavy, wet breathing had returned. It was louder, faster, matching the pace of something climbing relentlessly toward the summit. The wind outside the tower suddenly died down, leaving an oppressive, suffocating silence around the glass cabin. The only sound in the world was the dreadful, rhythmic breathing pouring from the radio speaker. The ranger backed away from the console, moving toward the center of the room. He realized that the breathing on the radio was no longer accompanied by the sound of crunching snow. The footsteps had stopped. The transmission was perfectly clear now, entirely free of static. The green dot on the monitor blinked one last time, resting precisely on the coordinates of Station 4, before the screen went completely black. The radio channel remained open. The breathing was so loud it rattled the small plastic casing of the speaker. It sounded wet and hungry, echoing in the confined space of the watchtower. The ranger stood frozen, staring at the reinforced door. Slowly, over the sound of the broadcast, he heard a physical noise outside the cabin. It was the heavy, distinct squeak of weight pressing down on the wooden planks of the exterior catwalk. Something had just stepped onto the deck that wrapped around the tower. The breathing on the radio stopped. At the exact same moment, something pressed itself against the heavy glass of the north-facing window. The ranger turned his head slowly. The security lights outside had burned out hours ago, leaving the deck in absolute darkness. But in the faint green glow of the radio dials, he could see a shape blocking the stars. It was tall, too tall to be a man, its silhouette hunched over the glass. A thick, pale mist began to form on the outside of the window pane, condensing as whatever stood there exhaled slowly against the freezing glass. The radio squelch snapped violently, emitting a high-pitched screech of feedback that forced the ranger to cover his ears. The sound was deafening, a localized blast of interference that shattered the quiet of the room. He squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the glass to break, waiting for the door to splinter inward. The feedback wailed for 10 agonizing seconds before abruptly cutting out. The radio clicked off. The power to the console died. The watchtower was plunged into absolute pitch-black silence. When the morning sun finally broke over the eastern ridge, casting a brilliant, blinding light across the snowfields, the relief crew from the lowlands tried to raise Station 4 for the daily check-in. There was no response. After 2 hours of silence, a tracked vehicle was dispatched up the logging road to investigate. They found the watchtower securely locked from the inside. The wood stove was completely cold. The radio console had been entirely dismantled, its wires ripped from the wall and scattered across the floor in a chaotic tangle. The ranger was gone. There were no signs of a struggle, and more unsettlingly, there were no tracks leading away from the catwalk into the fresh snow. It was as if he had simply vanished into the freezing air. The official incident report blamed a catastrophic electrical failure and severe isolation psychosis, citing the dismantled radio as proof of a mental breakdown. But the logbooks from that week were never entered into the public record. And according to the locals who live near the edge of the park boundaries, if you tune a shortwave radio to the emergency frequency in the dead of winter, somewhere around 3 a.m., you can still hear it. The sound of wet breathing, heavy footsteps in the snow, and a voice trying to remember how to speak.